There is a place in this country where the ground swallows secrets, where the bedrock beneath quiet towns and sunlit farmland holds something that nobody has been able to fully explain. Not geologists, not archaeologists, not the historians who have spent decades trying to map what lies beneath. Ontario sits above a buried world, a world of passages, cavities, and corridors that stretch in directions they have no business going, connect to places they were never supposed to reach, and whisper stories about people who should not have been here long before anyone admits they were. This is not a story about one tunnel. It is not a story about a single anomalous shaft found under a construction site and quietly closed back up. This is a story about a pattern spread across hundreds of kilometers, woven beneath cities and forests and lakeshores, tucked under farmers' fields and indigenous ceremonial grounds and colonial-era churches built on foundations older than the churches themselves. The people who found these passages rarely talked about them. The officials who confirmed their existence rarely published the findings, and the few researchers who dedicated careers to understanding them spent decades being politely ignored, their reports filed away in archives that nobody seemed eager to open. You're going to hear things tonight that the mainstream history of Canada does not include. You are going to hear about tunnels that predate every civilization this continent supposedly knew. You are going to hear about chambers sealed with methods we still cannot replicate today, about inscriptions carved into limestone walls and symbols that match nothing from the accepted record of North American cultures, about connections between the underground geography of Ontario and sites on the other side of the world that have no business being connected, about the indigenous oral histories that described all of this for generations, only to be dismissed as mythology by the very people who later found the physical evidence confirming everything those stories said. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is a particular kind of silence that lives underground, not the absence of sound the way you experience it in a quiet room. Something deeper, a weight to it, a thickness in the air that makes your breathing sound loud to your own ears, that makes every small sound travel farther and return from directions you did not expect. The researchers who have gone into the deepest confirmed tunnel systems beneath Ontario describe that silence as the first thing that gets them, before the scope of what they are seeing registers, before the questions begin piling up. The silence hits them first, and then the impossible geometry of the walls around them, and then the realization that someone built this, that someone was here, and that everything they were taught about who lived in North America before European contact is inadequate to explain what they are standing inside. The story of Ontario's underground mystery does not begin in any one place. It does not begin with a single dramatic discovery or a definitive date. It accumulates. It builds over centuries of separate encounters that were never properly connected because the people doing the connecting were dismissed before they could finish. So we are going to trace it from the beginning, from the earliest documented encounters with what lies beneath this province, and we are going to follow the evidence wherever it insists on going, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination becomes. The first documented accounts that suggest something unusual beneath Ontario's surface come not from modern explorers or academic researchers, but from the earliest French missionaries pushing into the interior of the continent in the 17th century. The Jesuits kept meticulous records. They were educated men, trained observers, and deeply skeptical of anything that smelled of native superstition, which makes it interesting that several of their accounts contain detailed descriptions of being shown underground passages by their Haudenosaunee and Wendat guides. Father Francois-Joseph Bressani, writing in the 1640s about his time among the peoples of the Great Lakes region, makes an oblique but unmistakable reference to what he calls subterranean galleries of the ancients. He describes being taken to the entrance of a passage near the north shore of Lake Ontario, shown its dimensions, told by his guides that it connected to a distant place that would take many days to walk on the surface, and then firmly told that entry was forbidden. He did not press the matter. He was a guest in a foreign land, and he understood, at least in that moment, that some doors were not his to open. What makes Bersani's account interesting is not the description itself. There are vague references to caves and underground places throughout the early exploration literature of North America. What makes it interesting is what he records his guides telling him about the passage's purpose. They did not describe it as a natural formation. They described it as made. Built by those who came before, in a time before the Wendat themselves had memory of. A structure, not a cave. A corridor with intention behind it, created by people whose name the guides either did not know or chose not to share with a Jesuit priest. Bersani was not the only one. Father Chaumonot, working among the Huron in the same decade, recorded a conversation with an elder who described a network of underground roads beneath the land between the Great Lakes. The elder said these roads had been used in ancient times to move people and goods without being seen, that they connected sacred places of enormous importance, and that the knowledge of how to navigate them had been carefully guarded for generations. Chaumonot, being Chaumonot, interpreted all of this as evidence of diabolical deception and moved on. He had souls to save. He did not have time to dig holes in the ground. These early accounts sat in Jesuit archives in Rome and Quebec for 2 centuries. They were not secret exactly. Anyone with the right access and the interest to look could find them. But nobody was looking for them, because the dominant story of North American prehistory at that point had no room for pre-Columbian tunnel systems. The continent had been empty before Europeans arrived, or very nearly so. The peoples who lived here had no architecture to speak of, no engineering tradition, no reason to build anything that would leave the kind of traces these accounts described. That was the story. That was what textbooks said, and the Jesuit records, sitting in their archives, did not match the story. So they sat. They might have sat forever if not for what happened in the winter of 1852 in a small community south of what is now Kingston, Ontario. Samuel Clark was not looking for history. He was a farmer, 43 years old, trying to keep his property functioning through a particularly brutal winter, and the problem that occupied him on the morning of January the 9th, 1852, was a section of his lower field where the soil had been behaving strangely for years. It had a tendency to collapse in certain spots, leaving shallow depressions that his cattle kept stumbling into. He had been filling them in for a decade, and they kept returning. He had assumed it was a drainage issue, something to do with the limestone shelf that underlay much of the region's farmland. That January morning, after a heavy frost, one of those depressions opened into something considerably more dramatic. The ground dropped away, not a shallow dip, but a genuine collapse, about 2 meters across, opening into darkness below. Clark, being a practical man, lowered himself in with a lantern to see what he was dealing with. What he found was a passage, not a natural cave, not a collapsed sinkhole, a passage with roughly hewn walls, a relatively level floor, and dimensions consistent enough that someone had clearly worked to maintain them. Ceiling height just under 2 meters, width about 1.5 meters, extending in both directions beyond the reach of his lantern. Clark did what anyone would do. He went and told his neighbors. Several of them came back with him the following day, and they went in further. The passage, they found, extended roughly 40 meters to the east before meeting a partial collapse they did not feel confident pushing through. To the west it went further, perhaps 60 meters, before the ceiling dropped to a height that discouraged further exploration. The walls were limestone. The floor showed traces of what appeared to be deliberate leveling, stone fitted against stone in a pattern that did not look like natural stratification. There were marks on the walls that nobody could immediately explain. Regular marks, not random scratches, cut into the limestone with apparent purpose. Clark reported what he had found to the local land office, which sent a surveyor to have a look. The surveyor confirmed the existence of the passage, measured its dimensions, sketched the marks on the walls, and filed his report. That report eventually made its way to the Provincial Museum, which in 1852 was a modest institution with limited resources and a great many other concerns. The tunnel was noted. It was described as possibly a natural limestone formation of unusual regularity, or possibly evidence of some indigenous use of a natural cavity. Further investigation was recommended but not funded. The file was closed. The surveyor's sketches went into a drawer somewhere in Toronto, and Clark, who had been hoping for rather more excitement than he got, refilled the collapse and went back to farming. He filled it in on the surface, that is. The passage remained. That passage, or what remained of it, resurfaced in 1901 when a road-widening project in the same area encountered what the foreman initially described as a worked stone cavity at a depth of about 3 meters. The workers who broke through into it described a small chamber, roughly circular, about 4 meters across, with a dome ceiling and what appeared to be a carved symbol in the center of the floor. They spent about 2 days exploring it before the project engineer, concerned about stability, ordered it backfilled. The symbol in the floor was not photographed. There was no one on site with a camera. The foreman sketched it from memory in his work diary, a circular design with radiating lines and a central point, and that sketch is one of the more frustrating items in the documentary record of Ontario's underground mysteries, because it matches descriptions of similar symbols found in passages elsewhere in the province that we will get to shortly. For now, understand that what happened in Kingston's rural hinterland in 1852 and again in 1901 was not unique. It was part of a pattern that was already well established by the time anyone began taking it seriously enough to compile it. That compilation did not happen for another 50 years. Dr. Frederick Melville was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist, trained at Queen's University in Kingston, employed for most of his career by the Ontario Department of Mines, and his professional obsession was the karst topography of the Canadian Shield's southern margins, the region where the ancient Precambrian rock gives way to younger sedimentary limestone and the underground drainage systems that carve through it over millions of years. Karst landscapes are full of caves and passages. That is not unusual. What Melville became interested in, starting in the mid-1940s, when he was already past 60 and had very little left to prove professionally, was the question of which passages in Ontario's limestone belt were natural and which were not. He had spent decades mapping karst formations. He knew what natural water erosion looked like in limestone. He knew the shapes it produced, the irregular profiles, the scalloped walls, the floor deposits that accumulated in predictable ways. And in the course of his mapping work, he kept encountering passages that did not fit, passages with wall profiles that matched quarrying rather than erosion, passages where the floor showed tool marks rather than sediment layers, passages where the geometry was too regular, the dimensions too consistent, the orientation too deliberate to have been produced by water moving through rock. Melville began documenting these anomalies systematically in 1946. He kept his work quiet because he understood that what he was finding, if he was right about what he was finding, was going to require an explanation that nobody in his field was going to be comfortable with. He was not a man who enjoyed controversy for its own sake. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply reluctant to make claims he could not back with physical evidence. He spent 9 years collecting that evidence before he published anything. In 1955, Melville presented a paper to the Geological Association of Canada titled Anomalous Subsurface Passages in the Ontario Limestone Belt, a preliminary survey. The paper described 14 separate passages or passage systems that he had personally examined and found inconsistent with natural formation processes. It included detailed measurements, geological analysis, and a careful, restrained argument that the most parsimonious explanation for what he had found was deliberate excavation by human agency at a date he did not feel qualified to specify, but which he suggested predated the accepted timeline of sophisticated construction in North America. The paper was received with polite skepticism. The Geological Association published it because Melville's data were solid and his methods were beyond reproach, but the discussion following its presentation was largely focused on alternative explanations, on the possibility that unusual erosion patterns could produce regular-looking passages, on the statistical likelihood that 14 sites out of however many thousands of natural karst features in Ontario was not a pattern at all, but coincidence. Melville defended his methodology and then went home and kept working. He had not shown them his best material. He had held back 3 sites he considered the most significant because he was not yet ready to defend them publicly. 2 of those sites he documented in subsequent unpublished papers that circulated among a small group of colleagues who shared his curiosity. The third he visited only twice, described in careful notes, and then appears to have decided not to write about it all. Those notes, found among his papers after his death in 1962, describe something that makes everything else in this story look comparatively ordinary. We will get to Melville's third site, but first we need to understand the landscape he was working in, because the geography of what lies beneath Ontario is not random, and the non-randomness is one of the things that makes it so difficult to dismiss. Look at a map of Ontario and trace the line of the Great Lakes. Lake Erie in the south, Lake Ontario curving northeast, Lake Huron reaching north and west, Georgian Bay reaching up into the Shield. The limestone belt that Melville was studying runs roughly parallel to the northern shore of Lake Ontario and extends east-west through what is now some of the most densely populated land in Canada. Below Toronto, below Hamilton, through the Niagara Peninsula, east through Prince Edward County, and past Kingston toward the Quebec border. This is the Ordovician limestone formation, somewhere between 440 and 480 million years old, a massive sedimentary deposit laid down when this entire region was the floor of a shallow tropical sea. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic water. It does this over millions of years, and the result across southern Ontario is an underground landscape of considerable complexity. There are known caves, there are documented sinkhole systems, there are springs emerging from hillsides where water that entered the ground kilometers away has traveled through the rock and found its way back to the surface. All of this is normal karst hydrology, and none of it is what this story is about. What this story is about is the portion of that underground landscape that does not fit the karst model. The passages that run in straight lines when water-cut passages are almost never straight. The chambers that are level when natural cavities form according to structural weaknesses in the rock, which do not produce level floors. The sites where the wall surface shows not the smooth, rounded profiles of water erosion, but the angular, planar facets of cutting tools. The places where 2 entirely separate natural cavity systems appear to have been connected by a section of clearly worked passage, as if someone found 2 natural spaces and decided to link them deliberately. These anomalies cluster in certain areas. They are not evenly distributed across the limestone belt. They concentrate around the north shore of Lake Ontario, particularly in 3 zones. The first is the Kingston to Belleville corridor along the Bay of Quinte. The second is the area around Peterborough and the Kawartha Lakes, north of Highway 7. The third is a broader zone north of Toronto, taking in parts of York Region and the Holland Marsh. These three zones are connected in the sense that passages documented in one zone appear, based on their orientation and the geology, to be part of the same larger system as passages documented in another. Nobody has traced the connections in full. The work required to do that has never been authorized or funded, but the geometry of what has been documented suggests that what lies beneath southern Ontario is not a collection of isolated curiosities. It is a network. The question of who built it, when, and why is where things get complicated, because the answer, or the range of possible answers, requires engaging with a history of this continent that mainstream archaeology has spent decades refusing to take seriously. Let us talk about what we know with documented certainty about human activity in Ontario before European contact. The answer is considerably more than the popular account suggests, and considerably less than the physical evidence on the ground implies. The established archaeological record of Ontario's Indigenous peoples is rich and complex. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Neutral Nation, and dozens of other peoples and confederacies left an extensive material record across the province. Their longhouse villages have been excavated. Their trade networks have been mapped through the distribution of copper from Lake Superior, of marine shells from the Atlantic coast, of flint from quarries in Ohio and New York State. Their agricultural practices transformed large areas of southern Ontario in the centuries before contact. They were sophisticated, organized, and present in large numbers when Europeans arrived. None of this explains the tunnels, not because Indigenous peoples were incapable of such engineering. The Indigenous peoples of North America built things we are still struggling to fully understand, from the earthwork complexes of the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures in the Ohio Valley to the multi-story stone architecture of the Southwest to the massive irrigation systems of the desert cultures. The problem is not capability. The problem is chronology and cultural continuity. The Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples who were present in Ontario at the time of contact had oral traditions that referred to the underground passages as ancient things, things built by people who were here before them, people whose identity was unclear and whose time was described in terms that placed them deep in the past, before the period of living memory that oral tradition can reliably preserve. The Anishinaabe spoke of the Mai Gwashi, beings associated with rock faces and underwater passages, connected in their tradition to an ancient and possibly non-human presence in the landscape. The word is often translated as a supernatural entity of some kind, but the original concept embedded in the stories is considerably more ambiguous and considerably more interesting than that translation suggests. What the indigenous oral traditions consistently say, across multiple separate nations with their own distinct histories and worldviews, is that the underground structures existed before the people now living in Ontario arrived, that they were made, that they were purposeful, that they connected important places, and that access to them was restricted and governed by protocols that had to be observed. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense. This is historical memory, the kind of memory that oral cultures preserve with extraordinary fidelity over very long periods of time, describing physical realities in the landscape rather than purely imaginary events. The question is what those oral traditions are remembering. In 2004, a construction crew working on a stormwater management project in the eastern suburbs of Peterborough encountered something that briefly became a local news story and then disappeared from the record almost entirely. They were digging at a depth of roughly 4 meters when their excavator broke through the roof of a cavity. The operator, Darren Kowalski, described in a local newspaper, interview what he saw when he climbed down to look. A room. He used that word specifically. Not a hole, not a cave. A room, with walls that looked like they had been finished, with a floor that was flat, and with what he described as markings on the far wall that he initially thought were graffiti before he realized the depth at which he was standing. The project engineer called the city called the Ministry of Culture, which sent an assessor. The assessor spent several hours in the space and filed a report that was, in terms of its public accessibility, essentially nothing. The ministry confirmed that a subsurface feature of potential archaeological interest had been encountered. They issued a work stoppage order for that section of the site. They did not publish anything about what the assessor found. The stormwater project was rerouted around the location. A year later, the work stoppage was quietly lifted and the construction resumed, but on the modified route, not through the original site. Kowalski gave his one newspaper interview and was never publicly heard from on the subject again. He was a construction worker with a mortgage and a family. He was not in a position to press the matter. Nobody else pressed it for him. This is the pattern. Again and again in the documented history of Ontario's underground anomalies, you find encounters that produce witness testimony, sometimes professional assessments, occasionally physical measurements and sketches, and then you find silence. Not active suppression in most cases. Bureaucratic inertia. Institutional discomfort with findings that do not fit the expected categories. The grinding machinery of official process, quietly and efficiently producing the outcome of nothing further happening, nothing further being said, until the witnesses move on and the moment passes and the record is a closed file in an archive nobody visits. The aggregated weight of those closed files is what this story is really about. By the 1970s, there was a small but dedicated community of researchers in Ontario who had become aware of Melville's work and were pursuing their own investigations along similar lines. They were not a formal group. They did not have a shared institutional home or a research program or funding. They were a loose network of people, some with academic credentials in relevant fields, most without, who had independently encountered the same anomalies and found their way to each other through correspondence and occasional meetings. The most significant figure among them was a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, who had trained as a civil engineer at the University of Toronto and worked for most of her career in municipal infrastructure before retiring in 1969 and turning her full attention to the question that had been nagging at her since 1957, when she had been part of a sewer installation crew that briefly opened into a pre-existing tunnel south of Toronto and been told by her supervisor that it was probably an old city utility passage and to backfill it and move on. She had known from the moment she was down in that space that it was not a city utility passage. She had been designing and surveying utility infrastructure for years. She knew what a Victorian drainage tunnel looked like, what a wartime utility corridor looked like, what any of the various ad hoc underground systems of early 20th century Toronto looked like. The passage they had broken into looked like none of those things. It was older in a way she could feel, rather than immediately quantify, and the limestone it was cut through bore no relationship to the glacial sediments and fill that underlay Toronto's 19th century infrastructure. It was bedrock, it was deep, and it ran in a direction that made no sense if it had any connection to the urban grid above. Holloway spent 12 years between her retirement and her first public presentation of her findings in 1981, documenting every encounter with subsurface anomalies in the Greater Toronto area and the surrounding region that she could verify through direct examination, credible witness account, or documentary evidence. She cross-referenced her findings with Melville's published and unpublished work, with the Jesuit records she tracked down in Quebec City, with the collections of local historical societies, with survey reports from provincial archives. She assembled what was, by the time she presented it, the most comprehensive survey of underground anomalies in Ontario that had ever been produced. Her 1981 presentation to a small gathering of independent researchers at a rented hall in Oshawa covered 87 separate document incidents across a 160-kilometer stretch of southern Ontario. Passages opened and closed during construction projects, tunnels intersected by utility workers, chambers described by farmers, well drillers, and hunters who had fallen through surface collapses into cavities below. She had organized these incidents by location, cross-referenced them against the known geology, and produced a preliminary map that showed the clustering she had identified, the 3 zones of greatest concentration, the apparent directional alignment of passages within each zone, and the troubling suggestion of connections between zones that, if confirmed, would imply a total system on a scale nobody had ever proposed. She also presented, for the first time, a serious attempt at dating. This was the most contentious part of her talk, and the part that earned her the most skepticism from the researchers in the room. Holloway had obtained sediment samples from 3 of the passages she had personally examined. She had sent them for analysis to a laboratory at the University of Western Ontario, without describing what the samples were from. The results placed the sediment deposition at between 4,000 and 8,000 years before present, which meant the passages had been open, had air circulation, and therefore some capacity to accumulate airborne sediment, at a minimum of 4,000 years ago, and possibly as many as 8,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago in Ontario, the conventional archaeological record suggests a pre-ceramic, pre-agricultural population of relatively small, relatively mobile hunter-gatherer communities. These were the archaic peoples of the Great Lakes region, living in small bands, producing a limited range of tools from stone, bone, and wood, and leaving no evidence anywhere in the archaeological record of any architectural tradition whatsoever. 8,000 years ago was the early Holocene, the period immediately following the retreat of the last glaciers, when Ontario was in the process of being colonized by vegetation, and the earliest human populations were following the retreating ice northward. These were the Paleo-Indian peoples, small groups of specialized hunters tracking megafauna across a landscape still being fundamentally reorganized by climate change. Neither population, according to everything we believe about them, was building tunnels, which means either the sediment dating was wrong, which the laboratory found no reason to suspect, or the tunnels predated the populations we know about, or both those populations were more capable than we have given them credit for, or there was someone else here that we have not accounted for. Holloway was careful not to specify which of these possibilities she favored. She was an engineer, not a speculative theorist, and she understood the limits of her evidence. What she said and what she stood by for the rest of her career was that the evidence she had compiled was sufficient to demand a serious, properly funded, systematic investigation, that the question of what lay beneath Ontario was legitimate and important and had been treated with unjustifiable neglect, that the people responsible for the archaeological and geological heritage of the province had an obligation to look at what she had found and either explain it or acknowledge that they could not. The serious, properly funded, systematic investigation never came. Holloway's research was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. It circulated among a small community of interested researchers and was occasionally referenced in the kind of publications that mainstream academics do not read. When she died in 1994, her notes and files went to her daughter, who donated them to a small heritage research organization in Hamilton, where they remain accessible but largely unread. The marks on the walls. We have touched on them twice now. The surveyor's sketch from 1852, the assessor's encounter in Peterborough in 2004. We need to give them proper attention because the marks are, in some ways, the most inexplicable element of the entire puzzle. Passages can be explained with some effort as the work of industrious prehistoric peoples using stone tools over a long period of time. Chamber geometry can be rationalized as the product of techniques we do not fully understand. Applied with skill we have underestimated, but the marks on the walls carry information. They are not decorative in any simple sense. They are not random. They are symbols, consistently applied, repeated across multiple separate sites in a pattern that suggests a shared system of meaning, and they do not match anything in the accepted inventory of pre-Columbian North American symbolic traditions. Let us be precise about what has been documented. Holloway photographed or sketched symbol sets from 11 of the passages she personally examined. When she laid these photographs and sketches side by side, certain elements appeared repeatedly across sites that were sometimes separated by 100 kilometers. A concentric circle design with a central dot, a series of parallel horizontal lines intersected by a single diagonal, a symbol she described as resembling a stylized hand or branch, with a vertical line producing multiple lateral extensions at irregular intervals, and most strikingly, a six-pointed radial design that she noted bore a close resemblance to symbols documented in several completely unrelated contexts: Neolithic passage tombs in Ireland, pre-dynastic Egyptian burial sites, and the rock art traditions of the Saharan pastoral cultures. Holloway did not make much of these resemblances in her public presentations because she knew how such observations could be weaponized to make her entire project look like fringe speculation. But in her private notes, the pattern clearly fascinated her. She had a research file dedicated entirely to parallel symbol occurrences in other parts of the world, and it was thick. The Holloway symbol file, as it has come to be known among the small community of researchers who have had access to her archives, documents what she found to be at minimum a suggestive overlap between the Ontario tunnel symbols and symbolic traditions from several other parts of the world. The Irish megalithic art connection is the strongest in terms of documentary evidence. The passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, Newgrange most famously, display a highly developed geometric art tradition that includes the concentric circle, the spiral, the three-rayed design, and the horizontal line with diagonal that all appear in the Ontario material. These Irish monuments date to around 5,000 years ago. They represent the work of a sophisticated, settled, agricultural people with a well-developed symbolic language and a tradition of monumental underground construction. The problem with connecting them to Ontario is obvious. 5,000 years ago, the Irish and the peoples of the Ontario interior were separated by the entire width of the Atlantic Ocean, and as far as we know, by complete mutual ignorance of each other's existence. No accepted model of pre-Columbian Atlantic contact places Neolithic Irish peoples in Ontario. None. The connection, if it is real, requires either a shared symbolic tradition inherited from a common, earlier source, or a degree of transatlantic contact in deep prehistory that the mainstream archaeological record does not support. There is a third possibility, that the similarity is coincidental, that concentric circles and radial designs are among the small set of shapes that humans across all cultures independently tend to produce, and that reading deep significance into the parallel is a form of pattern recognition error. Holloway considered this possibility seriously. Her conclusion, stated carefully in her private notes, was that the breadth of the parallel, encompassing not just individual symbols, but sequences and compositions, made pure coincidence increasingly difficult to sustain. She was not saying that Neolithic Irish builders came to Ontario. She was saying that both groups of people might have been working within a shared symbolic tradition whose origins lay earlier and deeper than either culture. The Peterborough petroglyphs. It is impossible to talk about Ontario's pre-Columbian mysteries without spending serious time at the most significant and most dramatically anomalous indigenous site in the province. The Peterborough petroglyphs, known to the Anishinaabe as Kino-Majawapkong, meaning the rocks that teach, are a collection of more than 900 carved images on a white crystalline marble outcropping in Petroglyphs Provincial Park, about 55 kilometers north of Peterborough. They are the largest known concentration of indigenous rock carvings in all of Canada. They were made over a long period of time, with the earliest carvings likely dating back 3,000 years or more, and they represent a tradition of careful, purposeful, ceremonially significant, artistic production that does not fit comfortably into any standard narrative of pre-contact Ontario. The petroglyphs include representations of shamanic figures, solar symbols, boats, serpents, turtles, and a wide variety of geometric forms. Many of these are what you would expect from an Anishinaabe ceremonial site of considerable importance, but some of them are not what you would expect, and the unexpected elements have been generating controversy since the site came to wide scholarly attention in the 1950s. Most provocatively, among the carvings there are figures that have been interpreted as representing large sailing vessels of a type inconsistent with any pre-Columbian North American watercraft tradition. The Anishinaabe were skilled and experienced water travelers using birch bark canoes of sophisticated design across the Great Lakes. They did not, as far as the accepted record goes, build ships with masts and sails. The carved vessels at Kino-Majawapkong look like they have masts and sails. Barry Fell, the controversial Harvard marine biologist who spent much of his later career arguing for extensive pre-Columbian contact between North America and the Old World, spent time at the Peterborough site in the 1970s and argued that several of the carved inscriptions were Ogham script, the ancient Irish Celtic alphabet used primarily in Ireland and Britain between roughly the 4th and 7th centuries of the Common Era. Fell's methodology has been widely criticized, and in many cases the criticisms are fair. He was not a trained archaeologist or linguist, and he made errors. But his work on the Peterborough site produced one observation that has not been as easily dismissed as his critics would like. The sequences of carved lines that he identified as possible Ogham are positioned in a way that suggests they were meant to be read, in combination with the figurative images around them, as a coherent statement, rather than a random accumulation of marks. Fell's proposed translation, identifying the site as a dedication to the Celtic sun deity Bel, and including a calendar formula for calculating solstice dates, may or may not be accurate. The evidence for it is insufficient to be definitive. But the alternative interpretation, that the linear mark sequences are purely decorative scratches with no semantic content, struggles against the consistent regularity of their placement. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of the Peterborough petroglyphs is that they represent an Anishinaabe ceremonial site of great spiritual importance, that the carvings document shamanistic visions and teachings, and that any resemblance to Old World writing systems is coincidental. This interpretation is reasonable and may be correct. The Anishinaabe themselves, in their traditions about Kino-Majawapkong, describe the site as a place of teaching and spiritual power, a place where the veil between the human world and other realms was thin, and a place connected by underground passages to other sacred locations in the landscape. That last detail, the underground connections. The crystalline marble outcropping at Kino-Majawapkong sits above a series of known natural crevices and fissures in the rock. Some of these fissures are large enough to enter, and the Anishinaabe tradition specifically associates these openings with a spirit world, accessed through the rock, a world below that was understood as real and navigable by those with the appropriate knowledge. The crevices have been documented by the park authorities. Their extent has never been fully mapped. The possibility that they connect to the broader system of worked passages that Melville and Holloway documented in the surrounding region has been raised and never adequately addressed. The park was established in 1976 partly to protect the petroglyphs from vandalism and weathering, and a protective structure now covers the carved outcropping. The fissures and crevices in the rock are accessible to park authorities but not to the general public. Whether they have been systematically explored is not a matter of public record. Let us go north now. The limestone belt that dominates the southern Ontario puzzle gives way as you move north past the shield boundary to the ancient Precambrian rock, among the oldest exposed geology on the planet. This is not karst country. This is hard, dense, metamorphic, and igneous rock that does not dissolve in water, that does not produce the kind of underground drainage systems that characterize the southern passages. Tunneling through Precambrian shield rock is an enormous undertaking, even with modern equipment. In theory, there should be no worked passages up here. The geology does not permit the same easy excavation that limestone allows, and there is no obvious reason for pre-Columbian peoples to invest the extraordinary effort that would be required. In theory. In practice, there are anomalies in the shield country too, and they tend to be more dramatic than their southern equivalents, because the geology makes it harder to explain them away. The most significant of these was documented in the early 1990s by a geologist working for a mining exploration company in the area north of Parry Sound. The geologist, who gave an account of what he found to a researcher named Michael Hartley, years later was conducting exploratory work along a section of exposed shield rock when he encountered what he initially assumed was an old mine adit, an entrance to a prospecting tunnel from the 19th or early 20th century. Mining exploration had been extensive in this part of Ontario during the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, and old adits were not unusual. What was unusual was the interior of the passage. The floor had been smoothed in a way that the miners' standard practice of rough blasting and minimal finishing could not account for. The walls showed not the drill marks and spalling characteristic of explosives-driven excavation, but a smooth curved profile consistent with a different technique entirely, one that removed rock in a way the geologist, drawing on his professional experience of underground rock surfaces, could not immediately identify. The passage extended further into the rock than he had equipment or inclination to follow on that particular day. He noted it in his field log, intended to return, and in the way of field work, never did. Hartley, who worked for years collecting accounts like this and publishing them in a small independent journal dedicated to pre-Columbian North American mysteries, was careful to note that the geologist's account was unverified and that the specific location he described was never returned to and examined systematically. He was also careful to note that it was not the only such account from the shield country. He had 3 others in his files, from separate decades and separate locations, describing what sounded like purposefully excavated passages in rock that should, by rights, contain no such things. The mechanism by which someone without explosives or modern drilling equipment could excavate through Precambrian shield rock in any reasonable time is not obvious, but it is not impossible. Thermally assisted quarrying, using fire to heat rock faces and water to rapidly cool them, causing spalling, was practiced by indigenous cultures in North America and elsewhere. Copper tools, available in abundance from the Great Lake Superior deposits that were mined extensively in the pre-Columbian period, could cut and shape softer rock more efficiently than the stone tools that dominate the conventional picture of pre-contact technology. And the pre-Cambrian rock of the shield, while hard, is not homogeneous. There are zones of weakness, areas where fracture systems in the rock make excavation considerably easier than the average hardness of the rock would suggest. None of this makes shield excavation easy, but it makes it possible given sufficient motivation and sufficient time. Motivation and time are the two things that pre-Columbian peoples had in abundance. They were here for thousands of years. They were not, despite the popular imagination, standing still. The copper connection deserves more than a passing mention. The old copper complex is one of the most remarkable and most consistently undervalued technological traditions in North American prehistory. Beginning around 7,000 years ago and continuing for several thousand years, the peoples of the Great Lakes region engaged in extensive, sophisticated copperworking using the native copper deposits of the Lake Superior Basin. This was not cold hammering of small copper nuggets into personal ornaments, although it included that. This was large-scale extraction, processing, and working of copper into tools, weapons, and objects of considerable technical sophistication. Old copper people were making socketed spear points, a sophisticated design that requires careful control of the metallurgical process. They were making heavy woodworking tools, including chisels and adzes of a type and scale that implies they were doing serious woodworking or stoneworking on a scale we have not fully accounted for. The copper artifacts of the old copper complex have been found distributed across a geographic area stretching from the Lake Superior Basin east to the Atlantic coast and south into the Mississippi Valley. This was a trade network of continental dimensions, moving heavy metal objects over thousands of kilometers, sustained over thousands of years. What were those copper tools being used for? We know some of the answer: hunting and fishing and the production of other goods. But the scale of the old copper complex, the sheer volume of copper extracted and worked over its multi-thousand-year history, suggests a level of productive activity that exceeds what we can account for if we confine our imagination to the activities the conventional record describes. There is more copper that went into this tradition than the tools we have found can account for. There are suggestions in the archaeological record of production far exceeding local consumption, of a copper-working industry supplying a demand that went somewhere we have not traced. Could some of that copper have gone into tunneling tools? Could the heavy copper chisels and adzes of the old copper complex have been the instruments by which the passages in Ontario's limestone belt were cut? The possibility has been raised and not seriously engaged with. Copper is soft enough that it would wear rapidly in contact with hard limestone, requiring frequent resharpening or replacement. But a well-organized society with access to abundant copper and a significant workforce could sustain that kind of attrition across a long-term construction project. The logistics are demanding. They are not impossible. What we would expect to find, if this was the case, is copper tool, debris, wear fragments, and resharpened artifacts in the vicinity of the tunnel passages. Several of the sites that Holloway documented are in areas where old copper period sites have been found nearby. Whether the co-location is meaningful or coincidental is another question that has not been properly investigated. The deepest documented anomaly in the Ontario Underground record is the one that Frederick Melville kept out of his published work and described only in private notes. Holloway found references to it, tracked down Melville's original field notes from the summer of 1953, and added her own brief investigation of the same site in 1973, before writing in her records that the location was effectively inaccessible, and the full extent of what lay below was beyond anything she could document with the resources available to her. The site is in Prince Edward County, the large peninsula jutting into Lake Ontario that is connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land near Belleville. Prince Edward County is underlain by a particularly pure and thick deposit of Ordovician limestone, and it has a documented history of cave systems and underground drainage. The Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, adjacent to the county, has its own oral traditions about underground passages in the area that are among the most specific and detailed in the regional record. Melville reached the site, which he designates in his notes only as Site 3, by following information given to him by a Mohawk elder whose name he records as Joseph. He does not say how he came to know Joseph or under what circumstances this information was shared. He describes a narrow entrance in a limestone escarpment on the north shore of a small lake, an entrance that required crawling to access and that opened after about 15 meters of restricted passage into a space of dramatically different character. His notes describe a chamber of considerable size. He estimated the ceiling at roughly 6 meters at its highest point, the floor area at somewhere between 300 and 400 square meters. The walls of the chamber were worked in the same way he had documented in other passages, but here the scale and precision of the work exceeded anything he had seen elsewhere. The floor had been leveled across its entire extent. The walls showed evidence of what he described as deliberate shaping, curved and angled in ways that did not look functional in any purely practical sense, but that produced, standing in the space, a sense of acoustic effect, of sound reflecting and collecting in a way that he found distinctly unnerving. But the walls were not what stopped him. What stopped him was what was on them. Melville was a geologist. He was trained to read rock surfaces, to interpret what he saw in terms of natural processes, and after his years of anomalous passage research, in terms of human activity that had modified those surfaces. What he saw on the walls of Site 3, he could not fit into either category. He described the symbols as unlike anything in any symbolic tradition he had any knowledge of. He described them as covering approximately 60% of the visible wall surface in the main chamber. He described a density and an organization that suggested not occasional marking or graffiti, but a systematic, comprehensive inscription of the entire space, as if the chamber itself was a document. He spent 3 days at the site, working alone, sketching and measuring, and trying to understand what he was looking at. On the third day, he found an opening in the far wall of the chamber that led, he wrote, down. He did not go further than the top of what appeared to be a descending passage. He could not determine its depth. He had inadequate equipment for what further exploration would require. He left the site and returned to his regular work, and wrote in his private notes, in his careful geological handwriting, something that he never wrote anywhere else in his entire professional record. He wrote, "I do not think this was made by anyone we know about." He never went back. He died in 1962 without publishing anything about Site 3. The location he describes in his notes is imprecise enough that nobody in the subsequent decades has been able to identify it with certainty. Holloway came close, or believed she came close, in 1973, finding what may have been the same entrance or a closely related one, and getting far enough inside to confirm the existence of a larger chamber beyond. Before water table issues made further progress, unsafe. She describes wall markings consistent with Melville's description and a floor that had clearly been worked. She did not have the time or equipment to do more. In her own notes, she added a single comment to Melville's observation. She wrote, "I believe him. It is 1993. A woman named Rosa LaChapelle is a graduate student in archaeology at the University of Toronto, working on her doctoral thesis about late woodland period settlements in the Kawartha Lakes region. She is not interested in underground mysteries. She is interested in ceramics and subsistence patterns and the social organization of small-scale pre-contact communities. She is a careful, rigorous scholar in the early stages of what promises to be a conventional academic career. In the summer of 1993, she is conducting a field survey east of Peterborough, examining a series of sites identified in previous survey work as likely candidates for late woodland occupations. At one of these sites, in a low-lying area near a creek, she encounters a feature in the soil that her training identifies as a possible cache pit, a subsurface storage feature associated with woodland period settlements. She begins to excavate it carefully, following standard procedure. The feature she uncovers is not a cache pit. It is the top of a stone-lined shaft, roughly a meter in diameter, constructed with worked limestone slabs, fitted together without mortar in a technique that she does not immediately recognize. The shaft descends beyond the depth she can easily excavate in the field. She photographs it, measures it, records its location, and writes it into her field notes as an anomalous subsurface feature requiring further investigation. She reports it to her thesis supervisor, who comes to look at it and expresses interest. Together they consult with the Ontario Heritage Foundation about the proper procedure for reporting an unexpected feature of possible archaeological significance. The Heritage Foundation sends a field officer. The field officer agrees that the feature is interesting and that its construction technique does not match anything in the established regional archaeological record. He recommends filing an archaeological assessment report and suggests that a specialist might be brought in to examine the stoneworking technique. La Chapelle files the report. The specialist examination is not scheduled. The thesis supervisor moves on to other concerns. The excavation season ends. La Chapelle, under pressure to complete her doctorate on the original ceramics and subsistence project she was funded to pursue, does not return to the shaft site. She finishes her doctorate, gets a position at a smaller university, and goes on to a successful conventional career. The shaft report sits in the Heritage Foundation files. Years later, La Chapelle, by now a tenured professor with the security to engage with professionally risky topics, writes a short paper about the shaft for a regional heritage journal. In it, she notes that she has never found a satisfactory explanation for the construction technique. She notes that the worked limestone slabs bore surface marks consistent with what she, having by then read Holloway's circulated work, describes as the Ontario tunnel symbol set. She notes that the shaft, when she attempted to trace its footprint in the archival record, turned out to be located within 200 meters of a site described in a local 19th century historical account as the place where a farmer encountered an underground room during well drilling in 1879. She does not draw sweeping conclusions. She calls for further investigation. She notes that the resources to conduct further investigation have not been forthcoming. She moves on. This is the rhythm of this subject. Encounter, record, report, wait, nothing. If you have been listening to this and thinking that perhaps the most remarkable thing about this story is not what was found but why it was not followed up, you are asking the right question. The non-follow-up has its own archaeology, its own layers, its own logic. Some of it is simply resource constraint. Archaeological investigation is expensive, time-consuming, and produces results that are uncertain and often inconclusive, even when properly funded. Ontario has thousands of documented and potential archaeological sites competing for a limited pool of research funding and professional attention. A series of anomalous underground features that do not fit the accepted categories and that require explaining why they are anomalous before you can even begin to articulate a research question about them is not going to win that competition against a late woodland longhouse village with clear cultural affiliation and well-understood research potential. Some of it is the professional disincentive to engage with material that the discipline has implicitly categorized as fringe. The pre-Columbian contact question, whether people from the Old World reached North America before the Norse around 1000 CE and before Columbus in 1492, is an area where serious researchers have been burned repeatedly by association with poor methodology and sensationalized claims. The academic reflex to treat all such questions with maximum skepticism has become so ingrained that evidence which might genuinely warrant investigation gets preemptively filtered out before it reaches the stage where proper evaluation could happen. Some of it, possibly, is something harder to characterize. There are people who have worked in this area long enough, who have accumulated enough experience of the specific pattern of encounters followed by institutional silence, who find it difficult to maintain the assumption that what is happening is purely structural rather than in some degree deliberate. Holloway herself, late in her life, told a researcher who interviewed her that she had come to believe that at least some of the non-response she encountered was not indifference, but avoidance, that certain people in positions of authority in Ontario's cultural heritage administration were aware of what she had found and had made a decision, not necessarily a formal or coordinated decision, not necessarily anything as dramatic as a conspiracy, but a functional decision that the implications of taking it seriously were ones they preferred not to face. She was asked what implications she meant. She said, "Everything we think we know about who was here and when." She said, "The stories we have agreed to tell ourselves about the origins of this country." She said, "All of it." She was not a dramatic person. She was an engineer. She was precise about what she could and could not demonstrate. When she said all of it, she meant the specific claims that her evidence raised and that the conventional story could not accommodate. But she said it with a weight that suggested she understood. Those claims went further than limestone passages and carved symbols on walls. Let us talk about the neutrals, the neutral nation, or Atawandaran, as they called themselves, and as their neighbors called them, were one of the most significant and least understood peoples of pre-contact Ontario. They occupied the territory between the Haudenosaunee to the south and the Wendat to the north and east, roughly the region that is now the Niagara Peninsula and the area around Lake Erie's north shore. They were called neutral by the French because they maintained peaceful relations with both the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat at a time when those two confederacies were in a state of nearly continuous armed conflict. This diplomatic position gave them access to both trading networks and made them, for a period, considerable players in the pre-contact political landscape of the region. They were essentially destroyed in the 1650s, absorbed and dispersed by the Haudenosaunee in a series of military campaigns that followed the disruption of the fur trade by European contact. By the time French missionaries reached their territory in numbers, the neutral confederacy was already collapsing. The records the French left of the neutrals are fragmentary and filtered through considerable cultural misunderstanding. What those records do include, consistently, is reference to the neutrals' relationship with the underground. Multiple missionary accounts describe neutral ceremonies that involved underground spaces, caves, and passages in the limestone of their territory, approached with evident reverence and significant ritual protocol. Father Jean de Brébeuf, who had more contact with the neutrals than most of his contemporaries, recorded in a 1640 account that their spiritual practices centered on what he called the world below, which he dismissed as satanic delusion, but which he described in enough detail that subsequent researchers have been able to identify specific geographic locations that correspond to his descriptions. At least two of those locations are in areas where Holloway documented subsurface anomalies in the 20th century. The co-location is either meaningful or coincidental. If meaningful, it suggests that the underground passages in the Niagara Peninsula region were known to the neutral peoples and incorporated into their spiritual geography, which would be consistent with the broader pattern of indigenous oral traditions, acknowledging the underground structures and treating them as ancient and significant. The neutrals also had, according to the Jesuit records, a tradition of what Brebeuf described as underground roads, passages known to specialists within their society that allowed movement through the landscape without surface travel. He treated this as pure fantasy, evidence of the kind of superstitious nonsense he had come to expect from these people. But the specific geographic references he includes in his description, when mapped against the modern landscape of the Niagara Peninsula, produce a routing that follows the limestone escarpment in a way that makes geographical sense for underground passage. Not proof, not close to proof, but another data point in the pattern. The destruction of the neutrals as a distinct people means that their specific knowledge of their territory's underground geography, if such knowledge existed in systematic form, was lost with them. What survived are the fragments in Jesuit records and the dimmer echoes in the traditions of the nations that absorbed them. It is one of the many ways in which the violence of contact era history has deprived us of information we cannot recover. The underground structures may persist. The people who knew them most intimately are gone. Now we cross the lake, the northern shore of Lake Ontario. Ontario's southern boundary is the focus of most of what we have discussed, but the lake itself is part of the story because the lake's current shoreline is not and has never been a stable boundary. 12,000 years ago, as the glaciers retreated, the land was still rebounding from the weight of the ice, and the water levels and drainage patterns of the Great Lakes system were entirely different from what they are today. Lake Ontario at various times in the post-glacial period was both smaller and larger than it is now. Its northern shoreline migrated significantly over the millennia. Coastal archaeological sites from the early post-glacial period, if they exist, are either deep inland or, more problematically, underwater. The underwater archaeological potential of the Great Lakes is enormous and almost entirely unexplored. Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Lake Huron together cover an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom. Their beds are cold, deep, and in the freshwater environment, relatively well preserving. Organic materials that would rot in a year on the surface can persist for centuries in these cold, low oxygen depths. Sites that were occupied when the lake levels were lower and that were subsequently inundated could, in theory, preserve evidence of habitation and construction from periods well before the conventional archaeological record of the region begins. A small number of underwater surveys have been conducted in the nearshore areas of the Great Lakes. They have found shipwrecks, as expected. They have found evidence of submerged Paleo-Indian campsites, which is not surprising given the changing lake levels. And in at least one case, documented in a technical report from a 2002 survey of the floor of Lake Huron's Alpena-Amberley Ridge, they found what the survey team described as a prehistoric hunting drive lane, a carefully arranged linear feature of stones that appears to have been used to channel caribou toward hunters, preserved intact on the lake bed at a depth that places its use at roughly 9,000 years ago when the land was exposed. The Alpena-Amberley feature is significant in itself as evidence of complex, organized hunting infrastructure at a very early date, but it is relevant to Ontario's tunnel mystery in a specific way. The same survey team noted in an appendix to their main report the existence of two additional anomalous linear features on the lake bed that did not fit the hunting lane model and that they could not otherwise explain. These features ran perpendicular to the shoreline of the now submerged ancient lake edge, extending from the shoreward shallow zone out toward deeper water, in a direction and with a regularity that the team noted was unusual for natural geological features. They recommended further investigation. The further investigation was not, as far as the published record indicates, ever conducted. Nothing about the Great Lakes bottom has been more surprising than how little attention it has received from the archaeological community. The logistical challenges are real. Underwater survey and excavation are expensive and technically demanding, but the potential is proportionally enormous. If the patterns of construction and organized activity that show up on land in Ontario also have maze underwater components, sites from the periods when the lake levels were different, then the story is significantly larger than anything the terrestrial record alone can tell us. There is a man who has spent the last 30 years of his life trying to get the Ontario Tunnel, question taken seriously by mainstream archaeology, and he has almost nothing to show for it institutionally, and an enormous archive of documented evidence to show for it personally. Marcus Webb is not an academic. He does not have a PhD. He has a background in surveying and civil engineering, not unlike Holloway, and he has spent 3 decades of weekends and vacations and professional leaves and eventually retirement crisscrossing southern Ontario with measuring equipment and a camera and a growing catalog of documented anomalous subsurface encounters. He knows where many of the sites that Holloway documented are located. He has found additional sites she did not know about. He has cross-referenced the Ontario material against similar reported anomalies in New York State, in Quebec, in Ohio, in Michigan, building an argument for a trans-regional pattern that he considers the most important unaddressed question in the archaeology of Eastern North America. Webb published a book in 2011, self-published, distributed through a small independent press, called Beneath the Shield, The Hidden Archaeology of Pre-Contact Ontario. It is meticulously documented, carefully written, and almost entirely unread by the people who most need to engage with it. The academic archaeologists who have encountered it have largely ignored it because of its non-academic provenance. The popular history audience that might find it compelling has no way of knowing it exists. Webb's central argument is this: the tunnel systems beneath Ontario are not isolated curiosities, and they are not geological accidents. They are the physical residue of a culture, or a series of related cultures, that occupied this region in the deep pre-Columbian period, organized its activity partly through the use of underground infrastructure, developed a symbolic system that it inscribed on the walls of that infrastructure, and maintained the knowledge of the system through oral tradition until the disruptions of European contact made that transmission impossible or dangerous. He does not claim to know who these people were. He considers that question currently unanswerable given the state of the evidence. He does claim that the evidence, properly attended to, establishes the existence of organized pre-historic underground construction in Ontario beyond any reasonable doubt. He considers the failure to engage with that evidence a failure of intellectual responsibility on the part of the institutions that exist to investigate exactly this kind of question. He is now in his early 70s. He has no institutional home, no research funding, and no expectation that the mainstream will engage with his work in his lifetime. He is not bitter about this, or at least he does not sound bitter. He sounds like a man who has understood for a long time that the work is the thing, that the archive he has built matters regardless of whether anyone in a position of institutional authority acknowledges it in his lifetime. He points out that Holloway's archive was ignored for decades and is only now beginning to attract the attention of younger researchers who are approaching these questions with fewer professional disincentives. He expects that the same will eventually be true of his own work. In the meantime, he keeps documenting. The question of intent. Let us assume, for the purposes of following the evidence where it leads, that the underground passages and chambers of Ontario were deliberately constructed, that they were not geological accidents, not the misidentified natural features that skeptics suggest, but the product of organized human effort sustained over a significant period of time. The question of intent, of why they were built, is then the central question, and it is one where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The three most common functional explanations proposed by researchers in this area are storage and preservation, movement and communication, and ritual and ceremonial use. These are not mutually exclusive. The same underground infrastructure could serve all three purposes simultaneously, and in many historical and archaeological contexts, it did. The grain stores and refugee tunnels of ancient cities around the world combine practical and ceremonial functions in ways that modern categorical thinking tends to artificially separate. The storage interpretation is straightforward. Underground spaces in a limestone belt maintain a relatively constant cool temperature year-round, making them ideal for preserving food, valuable goods, or other perishables. The evidence for food storage in the Ontario Underground, while not extensive, includes plant remains and organic debris consistent with storage use found during at least 2 of the documented passage excavations. This is the least dramatic explanation and probably the least controversial. Most pre-contact cultures in the region used underground storage in some form, and the elaboration of that into a more extensive and structured underground system is a reasonable extension of documented practice. The movement interpretation is more significant. A network of passages connecting important locations across southern Ontario would have been, for a society that understood and could navigate it, a remarkable strategic asset. Movement through the passages would have been invisible from the surface, protected from weather, and potentially faster than surface travel through dense forest or during winter conditions. The oral traditions that describe underground roads, repeated across multiple cultural groups in the region, point toward this interpretation. The directional orientation of many of the documented passages, running between points that are also significant in the surface archaeological record, supports it. The ritual interpretation is suggested most strongly by the symbol-covered chambers, by the acoustic effects that Melville and others have described in the larger spaces, and by the consistent emphasis in indigenous oral traditions on the underground as a spiritually charged realm. The chambers were not just functional spaces, they were designed in some cases, apparently with considerable sophistication, to produce specific experiential effects on the people who use them. The acoustic engineering of Site 3, as Melville described it, is not a byproduct of structural requirements. It is a deliberate manipulation of the space to affect how sound moves through it. Someone cared about how it felt to be in that room. The combination of these three functions suggests a society in which the practical, the political, and the sacred were not cleanly separated, in which the underground was a domain where all three converged. This is actually quite consistent with what we know about the ritual and social organization of the woodlands cultures of the Great Lakes region, in which knowledge, sacred space, and political authority were deeply intertwined. What is not consistent with what we know is the scale and engineering sophistication implied by the most extensive passages and the best worked chambers. There is one more thread in this story that we have not yet pulled, and it is the thread that leads furthest from comfort. Among the researchers who have spent time on the Ontario underground question, there is a recurring observation about the oldest passages, the ones where the sediment dating puts their open period furthest back in time, the ones where the construction technique is most ambiguous in terms of the tools that could have produced it, the ones where Holloway and Melville both expressed the strongest sense that what they were looking at exceeded the known capabilities of the cultures they understood to have been in the region. The observation is this: some of the passages are very, very old, not just pre-contact, pre-woodland, pre-archaic, potentially, going back to a period in Ontario's past when the conventional archaeological record describes the landscape as essentially empty, inhabited at most by small transient bands of Paleo-Indian hunters following a drastically changing post-glacial environment. a period from which we have almost no architectural evidence anywhere in North America, a period that our best understanding of the deep past places firmly in the category of before complex organized societies. This is not an easy observation to know what to do with. The methodological objections are real. Sediment dating is not infallible. Contamination can produce erroneous results. The specific passages where these oldest dates come from have not been examined with the systematic rigor that would be needed to be confident in the findings. Holloway knew this. Melville knew it. They both remained uncertain about the extreme end of the dating range, and they both remained certain that the passages were old in a way that the conventional narrative could not accommodate, even setting aside the oldest possible dates. The question they could not answer, and that nobody has answered since, is what kind of people build tunnels. Not what kind of people find natural caves useful, or dig simple storage pits, or shelter in rock overhangs, but what kind of people develop a tradition of systematic, intentional, large-scale underground construction, inscribe its spaces with a coherent symbolic language, orient its passages according to an understanding of geography that implies sophisticated surveying capability, and sustain this activity across a period long enough to produce the sediment record that the dating suggests. That is a complex, organized, knowledgeable society. It is not a society that appears in the conventional story of North America's deep past. It is not a society for which we have a name or a cultural affiliation or a place in the accepted sequence of pre-contact cultures. It is a society that, if the evidence means what the researchers who have examined it believe it means, existed in Ontario at a time when Ontario was not supposed to contain anything of the kind. Melville wrote, "I don't think this was made by anyone we know about. He was a careful scientist. He did not write things carelessly. He spent 30 years examining rock before he put those words on paper. He meant them with precision. Not anyone we know about. Not an unknown branch of a known culture. Not a poorly documented variant of the archaic tradition. Something else. Something that the available categories cannot accommodate. The passages are still there. Most of them. The ones that have not been backfilled by construction crews. The ones that have not been closed off by nervous municipal governments. The ones that have not collapsed under the weight of the development, spreading across southern Ontario's limestone plain. They are down there in the dark and the silence, holding whatever answers they contain, waiting for the investigation that has not come, that may never come, if the institutional priorities that govern such things remain what they have been. The relationship between what lies underground in Ontario and the oral traditions of the peoples who lived above it for the last several thousand years is where the story becomes most human and most painful. The Anishinaabe concept of the Mai Mai Gwashi, the Haudenosaunee traditions about the people who came before, the neutral nation's underground roads, the Wendat elder who spoke to Brebeuf about ancient subterranean galleries. All of these are not isolated stories. They are expressions of a consistent thread running through the knowledge systems of the peoples who have had the longest continuous relationship with this landscape. A thread that says something was here before us, something significant, something underground. These traditions were dismissed systematically by the European scholars and administrators and missionaries who encountered them. They were filed under mythology. They were treated as examples of the poetic and imprecise way that pre-literate peoples express their relationship with the natural world, the kind of charming but ultimately meaningless stories that simple peoples told to explain features of their landscape that they did not have the scientific tools to understand properly, except that these particular stories appear to be describing real things. The passages that Melville measured, the chambers that Holloway catalogued, the shaft that La Chapelle excavated, All of them correspond to specific geographic claims made in specific oral traditions. The stories that were dismissed as mythology were, at minimum, accurate descriptions of physical features in the landscape. Whatever else they were or were not, they were not fiction. This matters in a way that goes beyond the tunnel question. The systematic dismissal of indigenous oral knowledge as a category of evidence is one of the foundational intellectual errors of colonial-era scholarship in North America, and its consequences extend far beyond the specific failure to investigate underground passages. What the tunnel story illustrates with particular clarity is how that dismissal operates in practice. The people who had the most detailed and accurate knowledge of what lay beneath Ontario were the first people asked to provide it and the last people whose account was taken seriously. Their traditions were acknowledged when they led researchers to physical sites and then set aside when the full implications of what those sites implied became clear. The Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and other nations of Ontario have been making claims about the deep history of this landscape for as long as anyone has been listening, and the listening has been fragmentary at best and deeply selective at worst. A fuller engagement with what those traditions actually say, taken seriously as historical documentation rather than exotic background color, would substantially change the terms of this investigation. It would provide geographic information. It would provide contextual information about the purposes and protocols associated with the underground structures. It would provide a framework for understanding the symbol systems that might allow those symbols to be read rather than merely sketched and filed. That fuller engagement requires something that has been in short supply throughout the history of this subject: genuine collaboration between the indigenous nations whose traditional territory includes these sites and the researchers interested in understanding them. The few instances where such collaboration has been attempted, always informally and outside institutional channels, suggest that the knowledge exists, that there are traditions held by specific knowledge keepers in specific communities that contain detailed and specific information about the underground geography of their territories, information that has not been shared broadly for reasons that are entirely understandable given the history of how indigenous knowledge has been treated when it has been shared. 1999. A construction project in the east end of Toronto, a mixed residential and commercial development on land that had previously been used for light industry, encounters at a depth of about 5 meters a section of worked stone wall that initially confuses the site. Archaeologist, a young woman on her first major urban dig, into thinking she has found the foundations of a 19th century industrial building that the documentary record had not accounted for. She spends a day carefully exposing the feature, producing measured drawings, and trying to match it to any known structure in the historical record of the area. She cannot. The wall is not brick. It is stone, limestone specifically, fitted without mortar in a technique that she does not recognize from the post-contact period of Toronto's construction history. The stone surfaces show wear and patina consistent with considerable age, far older than the late 19th century period when this area was first developed. The wall appears to be part of a larger feature, curving in a way that suggests either a large chamber or a passage, but most of it is beyond the footprint of the current excavation. She reports this to the city archaeologist's office. A city archaeologist comes to look. The city archaeologist agrees that the feature is anomalous and recommends that an archaeological assessment be conducted before construction proceeds in the affected area. The developer, facing construction delays and the accompanying costs, is not happy. Negotiations proceed over the following weeks. Eventually, an agreement is reached, that involves a rapid assessment of the exposed feature, the collection of samples, the photographic documentation of what is visible, and then the continuation of construction on a modified schedule. The rapid assessment is conducted, the samples are collected, the feature is documented, construction resumes. The assessment results, when they come back, include a sediment sample date that places the last open period of the cavity adjacent to the wall at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 years before present, which is within the late woodland period, the period of well-documented indigenous occupation of the Toronto area. This date, which is in the range of the conventional archaeological timeline for organized activity in the region, closes the official inquiry. The feature is entered in the archaeological record as a possible late woodland pit or cache feature of a typical construction. The photographic documentation goes into the city's archaeological repository. The wall itself, backfilled and covered by the development's foundations, returns to the dark. The site archaeologist, whose name I am not going to use because she told me this story in confidence and has not chosen to go on record with it, described in our conversation what she had actually seen during the day. She spent carefully exposing the feature before any official response had been generated. She described the wall as too substantial, too well built, and too clearly part of a larger design space for a storage pit or cache. She described what she thought was a passageway extending beyond the wall in the direction the excavation could not reach. She described marks on the exposed wall surface that she sketched in her field notebook but did not include in the official documentation, because, as she put it, they were the kind of thing that would have raised questions she was not in a position to answer, and that would have complicated a situation that was already difficult enough. She showed me the sketches. I am going to describe what she drew: a series of horizontal lines intersected by a single diagonal, a concentric circle with a central dot, a six-pointed radial figure, the Holloway symbol set in a wall in East Toronto at a depth of 5 meters beneath a housing development, sealed and inaccessible and not in the official record. She is not a conspiracy theorist. She is a careful, competent professional who found herself, early in her career, in a situation where doing the professionally prudent thing and doing the intellectually honest thing were pointing in different directions, and she made the calculation that most people in that situation make. She kept her sketches. She told me about them 20 years later. She is still not sure whether she did the right thing. Let us try to assemble what we have. We have Jesuit records from the 17th century describing indigenous accounts of pre-existing underground passages and underground roads in Ontario. We have a series of 19th and early 20th century encounters documented in survey reports, newspaper accounts, and personal records in which farmers, well drillers, and construction workers broke into worked passages and chambers in Ontario's limestone belt. We have Melville's 1955 published survey of 14 anomalous passages, his unpublished work on 3 additional sites, and his private notes about Site 3 in Prince Edward County. We have Holloway's 1981 compilation of 87 documented incidents, her sediment dating results placing passage use at 4,000 to 8,000 years before present, and her observation of a consistent symbol set appearing across multiple separate sites. We have La Chapelle's 1993 discovery of a stone-lined shaft near Peterborough, its connection to a 19th century well drilling account, and the Holloway symbols on its walls. We have Webb's 30-year documentation project and his argument for a trans-regional pattern extending beyond Ontario's borders. We have the 1999 Toronto construction site, the wall, the passageway, and the symbols in the field notebook that did not make it into the official record. We have the Peterborough petroglyphs and their contentious inscriptions, the neutral nations' underground road traditions, the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe oral traditions about pre-existing underground structures, and the Mohawk elder who showed Melville the entrance to Site 3. We have the geologist's account of the anomalous passage in the Precambrian Shield north of Parry Sound. We have the underwater survey anomalies in Lake Huron. We have the clustering of documented sites in 3 geographic zones and the orientation patterns that suggest connections between them. And we have the absence of a systematic, properly funded, formally conducted investigation of any of this material. The absence of a published archaeological study that takes the accumulated evidence seriously and attempts to explain it within any framework, conventional or otherwise. The absence of any institutional response proportionate to the weight of what has been documented. The absence is data. The absence tells us something about how knowledge is managed and what questions are permitted to be important. It does not tell us what the tunnels are or who built them or what they were for, but it tells us that those questions have been treated consistently as questions that should not be asked too loudly. There is a phenomenon in the archaeology of difficult sites that challenge the dominant narrative of a region or a period, that researchers in the field sometimes call interpretive avoidance. It is not the same as active suppression. It does not require anyone to issue orders or destroy evidence. It operates through a much subtler mechanism, the collective disinclination of a professional community to invest time and resources in questions that carry professional risk without proportionate reward. The pre-Columbian contact question is the most obvious example. For decades, anyone who published serious research suggesting transatlantic contact before the Norse was professionally radioactive. The evidence was not necessarily engaged with. It was categorized as fringe and avoided. The result was not that the questions were answered. The result was that they were not asked, or when they were asked by people outside the mainstream, the asking itself was treated as disqualifying. The Ontario Underground question has operated in a similar way. The researchers who have pursued it have almost uniformly been outside the professional mainstream, not because the mainstream considered the question and found it unworthy, but because the question had been pre-categorized in a way that made mainstream engagement almost impossible. Melville was too close to the fringe by the end of his career to be taken seriously, even by people who had read his earlier geological work with respect. Holloway's background was in engineering rather than archaeology, which gave her material every reason to dismiss without reading. Webb's self-published book carries none of the institutional imprimatur that would force academic engagement. The irony is that the evidence they have produced, taken on its own terms, is not weak. Melville was a competent geologist doing careful field work. Holloway was a trained engineer doing systematic documentation. Their methods were sound and their records were detailed. What was not sound was the institutional context in which their work was received, a context that had pre-decided what the answer to the question was before the question was asked. This is not unique to Ontario. It is not even unique to North American archaeology. The history of archaeology is full of cases where evidence that did not fit the dominant model was dismissed, minimized, or ignored until the weight of accumulated anomaly became too great to sustain and the model shifted. What is distinctive about the Ontario case is the particular quality of the silence around it. Not just the professional silence of academic avoidance, but the institutional silence of official non-response. The filed reports with no follow-up, the assessment documents that do not appear in the public record, the construction site discoveries that generate a work stoppage and then a modified routing and nothing more. That institutional silence has its own history, its own logic, its own perhaps understandable motivations. The most complex of those motivations is the one connected to the colonial history of this land and the question of who is recognized as having a legitimate prior claim to it. If the underground structures of Ontario were built by a sophisticated pre-contact culture, and if that culture's descendants include the indigenous nations who are currently engaged in land rights negotiations with the provincial and federal governments, then the physical record of that culture's sophistication and territorial presence becomes evidence in a legal and political context that goes far beyond archaeological curiosity. The tunnels are not just a historical mystery, they are potentially testimony. This is not a comfortable observation. It implicates everyone in a more complex political dynamic than the simple romance of hidden history usually acknowledges. The people who might benefit most from the evidence are the peoples whose traditional knowledge pointed to it in the first place, and whose systematic exclusion from the institutions that manage that evidence has been both the cause of the evidence's neglect and one of its most significant injustices. The light comes from the west in the late afternoon, slanting across the limestone plain of Prince Edward County in a way that reveals every undulation in the surface, every slight depression, every place where the ground has settled over something below. If you know what you're looking at, you can read the surface like a text. There are depressions here that were not made by frost, heaving, or seasonal drainage. They are too regular, too consistently oriented, too specifically located relative to the local geology to be random. They mark the line of something below. Local farmers know the depressions. They have been filling them in for generations, watching them return. They have their own names for the phenomenon, their own folk explanations, drawn from a century of practical acquaintance with land that behaves in unusual ways. Some of them have stories passed down from grandparents about times when the filling in revealed something other than what was expected below. One family, whose property sits in the area that Melville identified as proximate to Site 3, has had 3 successive generations encounter subsurface features during agricultural or construction work on their land. They have not reported these encounters to any official body. They have not invited archaeologists to examine them. They have, in the manner of people who own land and prefer to keep it productive, dealt with each encounter in the most practical way available, which is to say, they have covered it back up and moved on. They are not hiding anything in the sense of conscious deception. They are doing what people do with land they depend on when they encounter something that would bring official attention and complicated procedures and work stoppages and the possibility of their property being encumbered by archaeological designations. They are keeping the information within the family the way people have been keeping information about the Ontario underground within various limited circles for a very long time. This is the human dimension of the story, not the grand drama of hidden chambers and ancient symbols, though those are real too. The everyday reality of a landscape that contains more than the official record acknowledges, known to varying degrees by the people who work and live on it, who have developed a complex and pragmatic relationship with that knowledge over generations. The official inquiry and the local knowledge have been largely separate from each other, and the local knowledge has consequently remained local, unconnected to the larger pattern that it is part of, privately held in a dozen separate places rather than available to anyone trying to understand the whole. Webb, when I spoke to him, described a conversation he had in 2016 with a retired highway maintenance worker from Prince Edward County. The worker, then in his 80s, had spent decades maintaining secondary roads across the county and had in that time broken through into subsurface features with road equipment on 4 separate occasions in 4 different locations. He described each one. The descriptions were consistent with the features documented at other sites in the Ontario record: worked passages, chambers, walls of fitted limestone, marks on the surfaces. He had reported 2 of the 4 encounters to his supervisor and been told to fill them in and move on. The other 2 he had filled in without reporting, because he knew what the response would be and could not see the point. He had not spoken about any of this to anyone outside his immediate family for decades. He spoke to Webb because Webb was persistent and because the worker, by then old enough that the professional consequences he had feared for so long were no longer relevant, wanted someone to know. Not necessarily to do anything about it, just to know. To add his 4 encounters to whatever record was being kept. Webb asked him where the 4 locations were. He described them. 2 of them were within a kilometer of locations that Holloway had documented from other sources. 1 was in the general area of Melville Site 3. The 4th was somewhere Webb had not previously had any evidence of activity, a new point on the map. Webb thanked him and drove home and added 4 more data points to the archive. The archive grew by 4 points. The official record remained what it was. The land above the passages continued to be driven over and farmed and lived on by people who mostly did not know what lay below them, or who knew and had decided, reasonably enough, that knowing was a private matter. There is a broader context for what lies beneath Ontario, and accessing that context requires stepping back from the provincial and looking at the continental picture. The tunnel and underground chamber tradition in pre-Columbian North America is not confined to Ontario. It is not even primarily known from Ontario in the popular literature on the subject. The most famous and most extensively documented examples are in the American Southwest, where the ancestral pueblo and cultures built elaborate kiva complexes, partially and fully subterranean ceremonial chambers, across the Colorado Plateau and the Rio Grande drainage from roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. These are well documented, well studied, and incorporated without controversy into the standard account of North American prehistory. Further east, the Hopewell and Adena cultures of the Ohio Valley, active roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, built enormous earthwork complexes that included underground chambers and passages as integral components of their mortuary and ceremonial architecture. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, Cahokia in Illinois, the mound complexes of the Mississippi Valley all represent traditions of organized underground construction that were, at their height, among the most sophisticated engineering achievements in pre-Columbian North America. The peoples who built these structures were part of continental trade and communication networks that connected them to Ontario. The Hopewell trade system reached into the Great Lakes Basin and beyond. Hopewell copper artifacts made from Lake Superior copper appear in Ohio mound burials. Ohio flint appears in Great Lakes sites. The idea that the complex ceremonial and engineering traditions of the Hopewell and Adena cultures had no counterpart in Ontario, that the Great Lakes Basin was some kind of dead zone in the network of pre-Columbian cultural sophistication, has always been difficult to sustain against the geographic evidence of connection. Ontario's underground anomalies, if they are what the evidence suggests, would represent the northern extension of a tradition of organized underground construction that is well documented to the south and west. They would not be exceptional in the continental context. They would be expected as the expression of the same cultural and spiritual priorities in a different geographic setting, with different available materials. What is exceptional is not the existence of such features, it is the quality of the non-response to them. The Hopewell mounds were documented, excavated, argued over, and eventually incorporated into the standard account. The process was not fast, and it was not without controversy, but it happened. The Ohio mounds went from being mysterious to being understood in the academic sense within about a century of serious attention. Ontario's underground passages have been encountered repeatedly for over 150 years and remain, in the institutional sense, unaddressed. The question of why the Ohio earthworks got taken seriously and the Ontario passages did not is not a simple one, and the answers involve some of the most uncomfortable aspects of how archaeological knowledge is produced and whose claims on the landscape it is used to support. In the spring of 2018, a team of graduate students from a university I will not name conducted an unauthorized ground-penetrating radar survey of a field in the Kingston area that Webb had identified as a high-probability location for subsurface features based on his documentary research. They were not supposed to be doing this. They had not obtained the landowner's permission. They had not applied for the archaeological survey license that provincial law requires for such work. They were young people doing something reckless and possibly illegal in the service of genuine curiosity, which is not an unfamiliar dynamic in the history of this particular subject. Their radar survey, conducted over about 2 days before they packed up and left before they could be found out, produced a readout that one of them described to Webb as the most striking thing he had ever seen on a GPR display. Linear features at depths between 3 and 6 meters, extending across the survey area in orientations consistent with the passage directions documented by Holloway. Not a single feature. A pattern of features. Multiple parallel and perpendicular lines, the signature of planned, organized construction rather than natural geological variation. The survey data was downloaded and stored and has been shared informally among a small group of researchers. It has not been published. Publishing it would require acknowledging how it was obtained, which would expose the students who conducted it to legal and professional consequences they cannot afford. It sits in the informal archive that has always been the primary repository for this subject's most significant findings. The private records, the personal files, the shared data among small networks of researchers who know what they have and cannot figure out how to make it count. The GPR data is not proof of anything beyond the presence of subsurface linear features. GPR cannot distinguish between a natural geological discontinuity and an artificial construction, not definitively, not from a surface survey. Follow-up excavation would be needed to establish what the features actually are. The excavation would require permission, licensing, funding, and the kind of institutional engagement that has been conspicuously absent from this subject for over a century. The GPR data is, however, precisely the kind of preliminary evidence that would normally trigger a formal archaeological investigation. When a surface GPR survey in an area of known historical significance produces results showing organized subsurface linear features, the expected response from the institutions responsible for Ontario's archaeological heritage is attention, investigation, a research program. The data has been informally shared. It has not, as far as anyone in this network knows, reached any such institution. Whether this is because the informal network has not managed to find the right path to the right desk, or because the desk it reached declined to respond, is unclear. What is clear is that in 2025, in the Kingston area field over which a team of unauthorized graduate students walked with a radar unit 7 years ago, nothing has been excavated. The field looks the same as it did. The features below it, if they are what the radar suggests, remain where they are. Let us talk about water. The relationship between Ontario's underground structures and the province's hydrology is one of the less discussed dimensions of the puzzle, and potentially one of the most informative. Water management is a primary driver of underground construction in almost every culture that has engaged in it. Cisterns, aqueducts, drainage tunnels, flood control channels. The history of organized societies is substantially the history of controlling where water goes and where it does not go. Ontario's limestone belt sits above a complex underground water system. Natural springs emerge from the limestone across the region. Seasonal flooding of low-lying areas has been a constant feature of the landscape since the post-glacial period. Managing water, ensuring reliable access to it in summer and protection from it in winter and spring, was a non-trivial engineering challenge for any organized society living on this land. Holloway noted in her survey work that a significant proportion of the anomalous passages she documented appeared to follow water table contours in ways that suggested hydraulic management rather than purely transit or ceremonial functions. Several passages were positioned to connect or divert natural water flows. One passage system north of Toronto, documented in the 1960s during a municipal waterworks project, ran parallel to and in apparent connection with a series of natural springs for several kilometers, in a configuration that a hydraulic engineer examining the survey documents described as consistent with a designed water collection and distribution system. The scale implied by such a function is not trivial. Managing water flows across a multi-kilometer underground network requires planning, surveying, and construction capability well beyond what we currently attribute to any known pre-contact culture in Ontario. It requires understanding of hydrology, of gravity and pressure and flow rates that goes considerably beyond the immediate empirical knowledge of a small-scale foraging or early agricultural community. But this capability is precisely what the other evidence in this story implies. A culture, or cultures, that planned and executed large-scale underground construction over an extended period, that developed a consistent symbolic system inscribed across multiple sites, that organized its activities according to a territorial understanding spanning hundreds of kilometers. Such a culture is entirely capable of sophisticated water management. The hydraulic function, if confirmed, would be one of the most significant implications of the Ontario Underground evidence. It would imply a relationship to the land that was not passive but active, not adaptive but organizing, not small-scale but continental in its ambition and its reach. It would imply that the land itself, the surface we walk on, the fields that grow our food, the rivers and lakes that define our geography, was in some sense previously shaped by people whose engineering we are only now beginning to acknowledge. Here is something that very few people know. In 1987, a federally funded survey of historical sites in the Kingston area produced, among its many unremarkable findings, a brief note in an appendix about an anomalous surface feature on a Crown-owned property near the Bay of Quinte. The note described a shallow linear depression, approximately 300 meters long, running in a direction perpendicular to the local drainage pattern, which the survey team considered possibly significant, but did not have the mandate to investigate further. The note recommended follow-up surface survey and possibly subsurface testing. The follow-up survey was never conducted. The property remained in Crown hands. The note remained in the appendix. In 2009, the same property came up for sale as part of a federal asset divestiture program. A developer purchased it. A pre-development archaeological assessment was required by the Environmental Assessment Act. The assessment was conducted by a heritage consulting firm. The consulting firm's report, a standard pre-development assessment, notes the linear depression feature from the 1987 survey, describes it as investigated but not explained, and recommends monitoring during construction of the depression's immediate vicinity. The recommendation was incorporated into the project's conditions of approval. Construction of a subdivision began in 2012. The monitoring protocol, as these things typically work in practice, was not rigorously implemented. No archaeologist was on site full-time during excavation. There is no record of anything anomalous being encountered. The subdivision was completed. The 1987 note and the 2009 assessment report are both in the public record. They can be found by anyone who knows to look for them. The linear depression they describe, if it was the surface expression of a subsurface feature consistent with the Ontario underground pattern, is now under a subdivision. Whatever it was, if it was anything, is not accessible. This is the cost of the non-response, not just the delay and the frustration of researchers who cannot get their questions answered. The cost is the sites themselves, vanishing under development, backfilled by construction crews, covered by foundations and roads and the ordinary infrastructure of a growing province, becoming inaccessible not by any deliberate decision, but simply because the window of opportunity to investigate them was not taken and then closed. Southern Ontario is one of the fastest developing regions in North America. The limestone belt that underlies the most densely populated corridor of the province is being developed at a rate that gives no indication of slowing. Every year that passes without a systematic investigation of the underground anomalies is a year in which more of those anomalies are covered, destroyed, rendered inaccessible. The archive of physical evidence is shrinking. The window is closing. At some point, the question of what lies beneath Ontario will become definitively unanswerable, not because the answer was found and was unsatisfactory, but because the evidence was consumed by the development before anyone looked seriously at it. Melville knew this. He wrote in his 1955 paper, in an understated sentence that reads differently now than it did then, that the pace of development in the Ontario limestone belt made early systematic investigation a matter of some urgency. That was 70 years ago. The urgency has not diminished. The investigation has not materialized. The night is deep now, and we are deep in the story, and it is time to bring in the thread that connects Ontario to a wider world. The question of whether pre-Columbian transoceanic contact with North America O'odham occurred has been one of the most contested areas in the study of the ancient past for over a century. The Norse contact is established. The Lance O'Meadows site in Newfoundland provides unambiguous physical evidence of Norse presence in North America around 1000 CE. Beyond the Norse, the evidence is murkier, more contested, and more freighted with the ideological anxieties that have always shadowed this question. The anxieties are understandable. Diffusionist theories of cultural contact have historically been weaponized to deny the independent achievements of non-Western cultures, to attribute impressive pre-Columbian sites to visiting Europeans, or Phoenicians or Egyptians, rather than to the indigenous peoples who actually built them. The reaction against this kind of racist diffusionism was necessary and mostly correct. The problem is that the reaction sometimes overcorrected, producing a professional consensus that treated any evidence for pre-Columbian contact with extreme skepticism regardless of its quality, and that made it difficult to distinguish between the genuinely poor evidence for racist diffusionism and the potentially stronger evidence for contacts that were real but did not fit the ideologically charged narratives that dominated the field. The Ontario underground material, specifically the symbol parallels that Holloway documented between the tunnel inscriptions and Old World traditions, sits in this contested space. We have already noted the resemblances to Irish megalithic art, to Neolithic Egyptian traditions, to Saharan rock art. We should note that there are also resemblances to traditions from other parts of the world that are even harder to explain by independent invention. The six-pointed radial figure that appears in the Ontario symbol set, the one that Holloway found in multiple separate tunnel sites, appears in a remarkably wide range of pre-modern symbolic traditions globally. In South Asian Vedic religious symbolism, in ancient Mesopotamian seal stone designs, in Bronze Age Mediterranean ceramics, in sub-Saharan African rock art traditions predating any known contact with other regions. This figure has something that transcends any single cultural tradition, appearing too widely and too early to be the product of diffusion from any single source. The most parsimonious explanation for this kind of cross-cultural recurrence is what the anthropologist Pascal Boyer calls the cognitive optimum hypothesis. Certain symbolic forms are cognitively natural for the human mind, appearing independently across cultures because the architecture of human perception and cognition makes them easy to produce and easy to recognize as meaningful. The six-pointed radial figure is visually striking, geometrically simple, and easily produced by any person with a basic tool and a surface to mark. Its appearance in Ontario tunnels, Irish megaliths, and Mesopotamian seals may mean only that humans across all cultures respond similarly to certain basic visual challenges. But the specific composition of symbols in the Ontario tunnel set is not just individual cognitively natural figures. It is a particular arrangement of multiple figures in specific relationships to each other, repeated across multiple sites in a way that suggests not independent invention, but transmission. You can explain any one symbol as cognitively natural. You cannot as easily explain the same sequence of symbols appearing in the same proportional arrangement in multiple sites across a 100-kilometer range. Sequence has meaning. Sequence is harder to produce independently. Holloway was aware of this distinction. She wrote about it at length in her private research notes, distinguishing between what she called elemental parallels, single symbols whose cross-cultural recurrence could be explained by cognitive universals, and compositional parallels, specific arrangements of multiple symbols that suggested a shared symbolic language rather than independent invention. In her assessment, the Ontario material contained both. The elemental parallels could be dismissed. The compositional parallels could not. She did not know what they meant. She knew only that they meant something, that they were the record of a communication system that someone had taken considerable trouble to inscribe on the walls of underground spaces, and that until someone took the time to read them systematically and with appropriate expertise, that communication would remain unread. It remains unread. 140 kilometers northeast of Toronto, on the south shore of a small lake in Haliburton County, there is a property that has been in the same family for 4 generations. The family knows about the passage under their land because the second-generation owner, a man who farmed the property in the 1930s, found it when a horse broke through the surface into a cavity near the east shore of the lake. He had the presence of mind to lower himself down before filling it in, and what he saw impressed him enough that he described it to his son, who described it to his son, who is now in his 70s, and sat down with Webb in 2019 to share the family account. The passage that the 1930s farmer found was not extensive, from his description. A low-worked tunnel, running east to west, perhaps 20 meters of it, accessible before it became too low to follow. Fitted limestone walls, a level floor, marks on the walls that the farmer, who had no context for what he was looking at, described as writing, but acknowledged he could not read. The space had the silence that multiple other witnesses have described, the heavy, thick, present silence of deep underground. The farmer filled the surface collapse and told nobody outside the family for 30 years, at which point he told his son, while conveying the practical information of where on the property to be careful with heavy equipment. The son added to the account the one additional encounter that had happened on his watch during the installation of a tiled drainage system in the 1960s, when a section of the drainage work crossed the apparent line of the tunnel and broke through into it. That encounter was brief. The drain tile was rerouted, and the family's policy of saying nothing was maintained. Webb asked the current family member whether he would be willing to have the property surveyed. The man thought about it for a while and said he was not opposed to a survey if it could be done without bringing any official attention to the property. Webb explained that a properly conducted archaeological survey would require reporting to the province. The man thanked Webb for his time and declined. This is the impasse. The evidence is there. The access is not. The institutional framework that would be needed to properly investigate requires a chain of disclosure and official engagement that the people with knowledge of specific sites are, for entirely rational reasons, unwilling to initiate. The private knowledge and the public investigation remain separate, and the separation widens with each generation, as the people who have the most direct knowledge grow older, and the social relationships that gave researchers, like Holloway and Webb, some degree of access to that knowledge, are replaced by the wariness of people who have seen too much official interference in their affairs to welcome more. The night always comes in the stories about underground places. The descent into the dark is the oldest structure in human storytelling. You go down, you encounter what is hidden, you come back changed. It is in every mythology that has an underworld. It is in every shamanic tradition that has a world below this one. It is in the Haudenosaunee tradition of the world below the earth as a place of power and danger and knowledge. It is in the Anishinaabe tradition of the Mai-Mai-Gwashi as beings of the rock face and the deep passage. It is in the neutral nations' underground roads. It is in the words of every person who has gone into these passages and come back trying to describe what they found. Something about the underground is not just physically distinctive. It is experientially distinctive in a way that crosses cultures and centuries, and the distinction between people who believe they are having a spiritual experience and people who believe they are doing archaeology. Melville, the cautious geologist, wrote in his notes about Site 3 in a way that he never wrote about any natural geological formation he had examined in 50 years of fieldwork. The young woman who found the wall in East Toronto described the day she spent carefully uncovering it as unlike anything else she had experienced in years of archaeological fieldwork. Not frightening, not supernatural, just different, weighted differently, significant in a way that she could feel before she could explain. This is not evidence of anything specific. Human perception in unusual environments produces unusual responses, and the underground is unusual enough to produce responses in most people, regardless of what is actually there. But it is worth noting that the experiential dimension of the Ontario Underground encounters is strikingly consistent across a very diverse range of people who had them at very different times and in very different contexts. The silence, the sense of age, the feeling that the space was made for a purpose that went beyond the merely practical. These responses recur. The indigenous oral traditions that describe these spaces as spiritually charged may be expressing, in the symbolic language appropriate to their tradition, a experiential reality that the spaces themselves produce in the people who enter them. The people who made these spaces may have been aiming for exactly that effect. The acoustic properties that Melville described at Site 3, the curved walls producing a specific pattern of sound reflection, are consistent with deliberate design for an experience rather than pure functionality. The space was built to feel a particular way. The people who built it knew what they wanted the experience to be. We do not know what ceremonies were conducted in these spaces. We do not know what knowledge was transmitted there, what decisions were made, what connections were made between the people gathered in the dark and the world they understood themselves to inhabit. We know that it mattered. We know that the effort to build these spaces and maintain them and protect the knowledge of their location and purpose was sustained across a period of time that we cannot yet confidently define, but that was long. The passages in the rock are the evidence of a sustained, organized, purposeful relationship between a people and the underground world of their territory. What exactly that relationship was is a question that the physical evidence raises but cannot by itself answer. The oral traditions might answer it. The knowledge that was preserved, imperfectly and partially, but persistently, in the stories of the nations who inherited this landscape might illuminate the physical record in ways that no amount of sediment dating or ground-penetrating radar can match. The collaboration that would enable that illumination has not happened. It has not been sought with the seriousness it deserves by the institutions that have both the resources and the responsibility to seek it. Webb, in the closing pages of his self-published book, writes something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He writes that the story of what lies beneath Ontario is not primarily a story about the past. It is a story about the present. It is a story about which questions are permitted to be important, whose knowledge counts as evidence, and what we are willing to encounter when we dig into the ground we live on. He writes that the tunnels are not strange because they are old and mysterious. They are strange because of how we have responded to them, by which he means how we have not responded to them. The strangeness is not in the stone, it is in the silence around it. He writes that he does not know who built the tunnels. He has spent 30 years trying to find out, and he cannot tell you with any confidence. But he writes that he knows from everything he has documented, and everything he has been told, and everything he has seen, that someone built them, that the building was deliberate and organized and sustained, that it was connected to a way of understanding this landscape that we no longer have direct access to, that the traces of it are still there, in the rock, waiting. He writes that the waiting is not passive. The ground beneath Ontario is not a neutral storage medium holding ancient information indefinitely until someone gets around to retrieving it. Development is consuming it. Time is consuming it. Every year of non-investigation is a year of diminishment. The opportunity to understand what lies beneath this province is finite, and the clock has been running for a long time. He writes, at the very end, we know the question. We have always known the question. The only thing we have to decide is whether we are willing to ask it. What does it mean for a country to not know its own underground? Canada's national identity is substantially built on the land, the shield, the lakes, the boreal forest, the prairie. The geography is the mythology in a way that is more literal here than in most places. The deep time of the land, the sense that this territory has been here longer than any human claim on it, is part of what the country tells itself about itself. In the national story, the deep past is before people, before nations, before the questions of who was here and what they were doing get complicated. The land precedes the history. The history begins with contact. If the underground evidence means what it appears to mean, that story is wrong, not just incomplete, wrong in a fundamental way. The land was not empty before the history the country acknowledges. It was organized, it was modified, it was understood and worked and inscribed by people who built things that we have not taken the time to understand, who developed a symbolic system that we have not taken the time to read, who had a relationship to this territory that predates every claim and every story that the official history contains. That is not comfortable knowledge for a country in the process of reckoning with Indigenous rights, with land acknowledgements, with the truth and reconciliation process. It is also not knowledge that serves anyone's interest to keep ignoring. The reckoning that Canada is attempting to do requires a more complete understanding of the pre-contact past than the official record currently provides, and the physical evidence from beneath Ontario is part of what a more complete understanding would have to include. This is not a call for any specific political conclusion. the implications of the evidence for questions of land rights and cultural heritage, and the relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state are complicated and would need to be worked through with the kind of care and genuine collaboration that has been missing from this subject since the beginning. What it is a call for is honesty about what has been found and what has not been done about it. Honesty about the pattern of encounters and non-responses. Honesty about the accumulated evidence and the accumulated silence. Honesty about the question that sits beneath Ontario's surface, unanswered in the dark. There is a night in early November when the limestone plains of Prince Edward County go very quiet. The tourist season is long over. The summer cottages are closed. The fields are bare after harvest. The sky is enormous and deeply clear, and the stars are visible in a way that the summer haze obscures. In that stillness, the landscape has a quality that people who spend time there in other seasons describe as newly apparent, a sense of depth, not just visual depth, the horizon and the stars, a depth in the ground itself, a feeling of thickness below the surface, of something underneath the thin agricultural skin of the place that is older and denser and considerably less placid than it appears. The farmers who work this land feel it. They talk about it in the particular way that people talk, about things they know to be true, but that resist the available language. The county sits on something. The ground has weight to it. They fill in the depressions, and they come back, and they fill them in again. They make the practical calculations, and they get on with their lives, and they carry the knowledge that you are living above something you do not fully understand, with the matter-of-fact equanimity that people develop when they have no alternative. Melville felt it at Site 3 in the summer of 1953, lowering himself through a limestone entrance on information from a Mohawk elder, crawling 15 meters to reach a chamber he had never expected to find, standing in the silence and the dark, with his lantern and his geological training and the accumulated experience of 30 years examining rock, and finding himself for once without an adequate category for what he was seeing. He sat in that chamber for 3 days. He sketched, he measured, he thought. He was a scientist to the core of him, and he knew that what he was seeing required an explanation he could not provide. He left. He wrote his 9 words. He never went back. Holloway visited the same site, or one very close to it 20 years later. She was equipped with a better lantern and a more developed theoretical framework, and the additional distance that comes from knowing you are following in someone else's footsteps in a place they found significant enough to withhold from their published work. She was in the entrance passage when the water made further progress unsafe. She had not reached the main chamber when she had to turn back. She returned to her car and drove back to Hamilton and wrote in her notes that she believed him. She believed him. After 20 years of researching this subject, after the sediment dates and the symbol sets and the 87 documented incidents and the Jesuit records and the oral traditions and all of it, she went to the edge of that place and was stopped by the water and came back, and the thing she wrote was not about any of the evidence. It was about the quality of what she had encountered at the threshold, the weight, the silence, the sense that something considerable lay beyond the obstruction. She was an engineer. She was precise. She believed him. The last thing I want to tell you about tonight is the most recent entry in the Ontario Underground Archive, a series of conversations that took place between 2020 and 2022, during the period when the pandemic had slowed all field work and many researchers had more time than usual for the kind of archival and collaborative work that normal schedules crowd out. During this period, a young Indigenous researcher named Thomas Swifthawk, who is Mohawk, from the Tyendinaga territory adjacent to Prince Edward County, and who was completing a graduate degree in Indigenous Studies at York University, made contact with Marcus Webb and subsequently with the small network of researchers connected to the Holloway Archive. Swifthawk had grown up with stories about the underground passages in his community's territory. Not vague legends, but specific stories told to him by his grandmother and her sisters, connecting particular locations in the landscape to particular passages and giving particular names to the places where entry was appropriate and the places where it was not. Swifthawk was not a geologist or an archaeologist. He was a researcher interested in how traditional knowledge is transmitted and preserved, and in the specific relationship between the oral traditions of the Tyendinaga community and the physical landscape of their territory. When he encountered Webb's work, he recognized in it the physical correlates of the stories he had been told. The locations Webb had documented from various 20th century sources corresponded in several cases to locations that existed in the Tyendinaga oral tradition as significant places. He and Webb spent 2 years comparing notes. They were careful about what they shared and what they did not, and they were particularly careful about the locations that Swifthawk's community considered restricted. But in the areas where community protocols permitted discussion, the correspondence between the documentary record and the oral tradition was, Swifthawk told me, extraordinary. Not just approximate, specific. Names and descriptions in the oral tradition matched documentary, evidence from sources that the oral tradition had no way of accessing, and vice versa. Swifthawk presented some of his findings, carefully and selectively, at a conference on Indigenous historical knowledge at York University in 2022. The reception was mixed in the way that this subject always receives mixed responses. Some of his colleagues found the work genuinely exciting. Others were skeptical of the collaboration with a non-Indigenous independent researcher who did not have academic credentials. A few were uncomfortable with the implications of the physical evidence for the political questions about land and rights that the Tyendinaga community was simultaneously engaged with in other forums. Swifthawk is still working on this. He is not finished. He has a body of knowledge that he is navigating carefully between the community obligations that govern its use and the academic and public conversations that it could potentially contribute to. He is thinking about what it would mean to share it and how and with what protections and what the legitimate expectations of his community are regarding the use of knowledge that the community has held and protected for a very long time. He does not expect the mainstream archaeological establishment to come looking for him. He has watched what happened to everyone who has brought this material to that establishment's attention over the past 100 years. He knows how that goes. He is making his own plan in his own time according to priorities that are not shaped by the publication timelines and career incentives of an institution he has no particular obligation to. He knows what lies beneath his community's territory. He knows it from the stories, and he knows it from the documentary record, and he knows it from the one visit he has made, with family members, to a place in the landscape that the stories describe and the documents corroborate, a place where the ground is thin and the passage below is old, and the silence is the kind of silence that speaks. He knows, and he is deciding what to do with that knowledge. And whatever he decides, the knowledge will persist. It has persisted this long. The tunnels are still there, most of them, under the farms and the subdivisions and the suburban developments spreading across the limestone plain, under the roads and the utility corridors and the construction projects that generate their brief encounters and their closed files and their recommended but unfunded follow-up investigations. Under the winter fields where the depressions keep returning to the surface despite generations of filling in. The worked walls, the fitted floors, the symbols no one has systematically read, the acoustic chambers designed by people whose name we do not know, for purposes we have not determined, at a date we cannot fully establish. The passage at Melville Site 3, descending from the chamber with its inscribed walls into the dark below, to a depth he did not reach, and nobody has reached since. The silence down there is not empty. The silence is information. The silence is the accumulated weight of a history this land holds that the country built on top of it has not found the courage or the resources or the will to face. The silence is a question that has been asked quietly and persistently by every crack in the limestone that opens under a farmer's field, every passage that a construction crew stumbles into and fills back in, every symbol on a wall that a careful researcher sketches in a notebook and carries home and adds to an archive that nobody in authority is reading. The question has been there a long time. What lies beneath Ontario that we don't know about? Who was here, and what did they build, and what did they mean by it? What are we afraid to find? The ground does not answer. The ground holds. The passages run in the dark. The symbols wait on the walls. The silence is deep and cold and old, and it is not going anywhere, and one day someone will go down into it with the resources and the authorization and the genuine will to understand what they find, and they will read what is written there, and whatever they find will change the story we tell about this land. It will not be a comfortable change. Important corrections rarely are, but the passages are still there, and the question is still open, and the night down in the limestone dark beneath the fields and the subdivisions and the roads of southern Ontario is very, very long. This is not the end of the story. It cannot be the end of the story because the investigation has not been conducted, the records have not been opened, the oral traditions have not been fully engaged with, the archive has not been read by the people with the power to act on it, and the land is still being developed at a pace that outstrips the non-existent research program. The story will continue. New encounters will be made, new files will be opened and closed, new researchers will find their way to the materials that Holloway and Melville and Webb have assembled. Young people like Thomas Swifthawk will make their own decisions about their own knowledge and their own communities, and what they choose to share with a world that has not earned that sharing, but that cannot proceed honestly without it. The story will continue because the ground beneath Ontario will continue to be broken and occasionally to open into what it contains, and every time it opens, the same question will be asked and the same calculation will be made about whether this is the time to push the question harder, and eventually, probably, someone will push it at a moment when the resistance is less than it has been, when the institutional conditions have shifted, when the political context has changed enough that the implications of what lies below are not as threatening as they have been to those who manage the official record. History works this way. Questions that cannot be answered in one generation get handed to the next. The evidence accumulates. The silence becomes harder to maintain. At some point, the thing that everyone has been carefully not looking at becomes impossible to continue not looking at, and the looking happens, and the answer is whatever the answer is. For now, the night is long, and the passages are deep, and the symbols are on the walls, and nobody who has the authority to read them officially has come to read them. For now, the archaeology of silence has its own methodology. You cannot excavate a non-response. You cannot carbon date an institutional decision to look the other way, but you can trace the silence through the administrative record, through the gap between what was reported and what was followed up, between what was found and what was published, between the questions that were asked and the ones that received answers, and the tracing reveals a shape, an outline, the negative space that defines something present by marking everything around it. Frederick Melville left behind 23 field notebooks from his anomalous passage survey work between 1946 and 1960. 14 of those notebooks are in the Queen's University archives in Kingston, donated by his estate in 1965, 9 are not. The Queen's archivist, when Webb inquired about the missing notebooks, confirmed that the 14 received were the entirety of what the estate donated. The estate lawyer, long deceased, left no record of the remaining 9. Melville's family, which Webb tracked down through considerable effort, had no knowledge of where the missing notebooks went. The gap is not suspicious in itself. Notebooks get lost. Estates are imperfectly organized. Items that were not considered valuable at the time of a bequest do not always make it to their intended destination. But 9 of Melville's field notebooks from the most significant period of his survey work are simply not in the record. And the notebooks that are in the archive, the 14 at Queen's, contain no entries about Site 3 or about the 2 other sites Melville mentioned in private correspondence but held back from his published work. The assumption is that those entries were in the missing notebooks. The further assumption, which nobody can confirm, is that Melville kept the most sensitive material in specific notebooks that were either never donated or were removed from the estate materials before the donation was made. By whom and why, if that is what happened, is not knowable from the current evidence. What is knowable is that the most significant portion of Melville's documentary record is not accessible, and that in the decades since his death, nobody with institutional resources has made a serious effort to trace the missing notebooks. They are not in the public record. They are presumably somewhere. The question of where has not been asked loudly enough to produce an answer. Patricia Holloway's archive, the files donated to the Hamilton Heritage Organization after her death in 1994, is more complete. Webb has worked through it extensively. It is not perfectly organized in the way that a personal research archive assembled over 40 years by one person rarely is, but it is substantially intact and substantially coherent. What it reveals, beyond the compiled evidence that Holloway herself described in her 1981 presentation and subsequent work, is the full extent of the official non-response to her research and the effect of that non-response on her over the years. The archive contains Holloway's correspondence files for the period from 1975 to 1993. She wrote to the Ministry of Culture, the Ontario Heritage Foundation, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Archaeological Survey of Canada, several university archaeology departments, and a number of individual academic archaeologists whose published work touched on areas related to her research. The pattern in the responses she received, to the extent that she received responses at all, is educational. The Ministry of Culture acknowledged receipt of her materials and referred her to the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation acknowledged receipt and suggested she might want to submit a formal research proposal for consideration in their grant program. She submitted a proposal. The proposal was declined on the grounds that the research question was insufficiently defined and the methodology lacked appropriate scholarly framework. She wrote back requesting specific guidance on how to better define the research question and framework. The response to that letter is not in the archive, which probably means she did not receive one. The ROM wrote back once, a single paragraph letter from a staff archaeologist, noting that the material she had submitted did not fall within the museum's current research program areas, and suggesting she contact the relevant provincial government body, which was the Ministry of Culture, completing the circle. Of the university archaeologists she contacted, 3 wrote substantive responses. One was a polite but firm assertion that the kind of pre-contact tunnel construction she was describing was impossible given what was known about the capabilities of the relevant cultural periods, and that while her documentation efforts were admirable, the interpretation she was placing on the evidence was unsupported. The second was warmer in tone but similarly dismissive in substance, suggesting that what she had found was a collection of natural karst features that she, as a non-specialist, was misidentifying as worked passages. The third, an archaeologist at a smaller Ontario university whose work Holloway had cited approvingly in her 1981 presentation, wrote several paragraphs of genuine engagement with her evidence, and ended by saying that he found the material genuinely interesting, but that he was not in a position to publicly associate himself with research in this area, given the professional risks, and that he wished her well. The frankness of that third letter is striking in context. He was not saying her evidence was wrong. He was saying that engaging with it publicly would cost him more than he was willing to pay. This is the honest version of what the other respondents expressed less candidly. The barrier was not epistemic. It was professional. The evidence was interesting enough that a trained archaeologist found it worth several paragraphs of genuine engagement. It was not interesting enough, or rather, the professional risk of being seen engaging with it was too high for that engagement to go anywhere. Holloway filed all 3 responses in the same folder. She labeled the folder with a word that, given her characteristic precision and her background as an engineer who chose words with care, is worth noting. She labeled it obstacles. Now let us go to the edge of something. There are a small number of sites in the Ontario underground record where the evidence points towards something that does not fit even the most expansive interpretation of what a sophisticated pre-contact indigenous culture could have produced. These are the sites that Melville approached with his 9 words and Holloway approached with her 2-word confirmation, and that the small community of researchers who have had access to the most complete documentation approach with a careful, professional reluctance to say exactly what they think. The reluctance is understandable. The moment you start discussing evidence that does not fit known human capabilities, you have entered the territory where the credible and the incredible become difficult to separate, where the pattern recognition errors that produce false connections become indistinguishable from the genuine pattern. Recognition that reveals real ones. The researchers who have stayed closest to the evidence in this field have stayed close to it by maintaining that reluctance, by saying what the evidence shows and no more, by declining to speculate about implications they cannot support with physical documentation. But there are those sites, and the documentation of them, while it falls short of proof of anything in particular, falls short of proof of nothing in particular as well. What the documentation shows is that in at least 3 locations in Ontario's underground record, the physical evidence of construction technique and spatial design implies a level of precision that exceeds, sometimes significantly, what any known pre-contact North American tradition could plausibly account for. The most striking of these is not Site 3, which is inadequately documented for reasons we have discussed. It is a site northwest of Peterborough, documented partly by Holloway in the late 1970s, and partly by a geotechnical engineer named Reginald Park in a 1989 subsurface survey conducted as part of a highway expansion assessment. Park's survey, part of the public record because it was conducted for a government project, includes a section describing what the survey team encountered when a test bore broke through into a pre-existing cavity at a depth of 11 meters. The bore log, which is a technical document recording everything the drilling equipment encounters at progressive depths, shows the cavity beginning at 11.3 meters and extending to at least 12.8 meters, which was the depth at which the bore was terminated. The cavity walls, as assessed from the bore, log data, and from a subsequent probe camera insertion, showed surfaces inconsistent with natural formation. The probe camera images, low resolution but interpretable, show what the geotechnical team's report describes as possibly worked limestone surfaces with regular features, what the report does not describe, but what Park noted in a personal memo to the project engineer that eventually made its way to Holloway and then to Webb, is the measurement data from the cavity walls. The probe camera was equipped with a laser distance measurement system, standard in geotechnical surveys of this type, and the measurement data from the cavity walls showed a degree of surface regularity in the mathematical sense of minimal deviation from perfect planarity that the probe data analyst found striking enough to note. The deviation from planarity across the measured wall surface was less than 1 centimeter over a span of approximately 2 meters, less than 1 centimeter over 2 meters in a limestone surface at a depth of 11 meters. Either this is a natural formation of extraordinary regularity, which Park's report acknowledged as technically possible, but described as highly unusual, or it is an artificial surface finished to a tolerance that, in Park's own words in his personal memo, would challenge modern CNC machining. CNC machining, computer numerical control machining, the kind of precision that, in the modern world, you achieve with computer-controlled cutting equipment, the kind of precision that, in the pre-contact world, you're not supposed to be able to achieve with stone and copper tools. Park does not suggest ancient astronauts. He is a geotechnical engineer, and his personal memo reflects the tone of a careful professional who has encountered something that he cannot explain and is noting it for the record, without drawing conclusions he cannot support. He notes the measurement. He notes his surprise at it. He notes that further investigation would be warranted. He moves on. The highway assessment report was filed. The highway was built. The bore location was covered by infrastructure. Whatever the cavity contained, whatever produced that remarkable surface regularity, is now 11 meters below Ontario Highway 115. It would be easy to hear all of this and conclude that the story is pointing towards something dramatic. A lost civilization, an ancient advanced culture, visitors from elsewhere, some revelation that overturns everything we think we know about human history. The popular appetite for exactly that kind of conclusion is the reason this material tends to get absorbed into fringe publishing and conspiracy culture rather than serious academic discourse. But the evidence does not point there. The evidence, read carefully and without the pressure to resolve it into a satisfying narrative, points somewhere considerably less dramatic and considerably more important. It points toward a profound incompleteness in our understanding of the pre-contact past of this specific region. Not a civilization of unknown sophistication, not aliens or ancient gods, just the probability that the peoples who lived in Ontario for thousands of years before European contact were more capable, more organized, and more geographically ambitious than the standard narrative gives them credit for, and that the failure to investigate what they left behind and the failure to properly engage with the knowledge that their descendants have preserved in oral tradition represents one of the more significant intellectual failures of the institutional history of this region. That is the actual claim of the evidence. Not that everything we know is wrong, that what we know is insufficient, that the question is larger than the answer we have accepted, that there is more to find, and that finding it requires honesty about what has been avoided and willingness to look at what has been there all along. The tunnels are not a mystery in the sense of something without an explanation. They are a mystery in the sense of something for which the investigation needed to produce. An explanation has not been conducted. The difference is important. A genuine mystery is a thing we cannot know. What lies beneath Ontario is a thing we have chosen not to find out. The choice can be unmade. The spring thaw in Prince Edward County comes in late March most years, earlier in warm years, and when it comes with a particular quality of light that the farmers there describe as revealing. After the snow and the gray months of February and the ice, the ground emerges from winter looking different than it did in fall. The frost has moved things. The surface has shifted in small ways that catch the early spring light at angles you don't see at other times of year. The depressions that have been filling in since the previous spring are fresh again. The ground is soft enough to collapse into them. An old farmer in his pickup truck, stopping to look at a new depression that appeared overnight at the edge of his east field, knows what it is. He has been filling in depressions in this field since he took over the property from his father 30 years ago, and his father had filled in depressions before him. He gets out of the truck and looks into it. A couple of meters across, a meter or so deep, and at the bottom, the familiar dark opening, where the frost has broken through the thin roof of limestone above whatever is below. He can feel, standing at the edge, the exhalation of cold air rising from the opening. He does not go in. He does not report it. He does not call the university or the ministry or any of the official bodies that theoretically exist to manage exactly this kind of thing. He has nothing against any of those people, but he has a farm to run, and the last thing he needs is a provincial archaeologist showing up and putting a work stop on his field during spring planting. He drives back to the barn, gets his tractor, comes back with a load of gravel and topsoil and fills it in. The opening closes. The field returns to its unremarkable surface. The limestone below it continues holding whatever it holds. The cold air from the passage below stops rising until the next frost, when the cycle begins again. The river of knowledge that flows through this story is not just geological, it is human. It is the accumulated record of encounters and reflections and careful observations made by a succession of people over a period of nearly 4 centuries, starting with the Jesuit missionaries who did not know what to make of what their guides were showing them, and continuing through to the young Mohawk researcher who is still deciding what to do with the knowledge he carries. What connects these people across centuries of time and vastly different contexts and world views is the experience of standing at the edge of something that the available categories cannot contain, something that the dominant narrative of the time has not prepared them for, something that requires, if you're going to take it seriously, a willingness to question things that are usually treated as settled. The Jesuit priests who recorded the underground traditions of the peoples they were trying to convert were not prepared for those traditions to describe real physical features. They filed them under superstition and moved on, but they wrote them down, and the writing down is what allows us to trace the connection between the 17th century accounts and the 20th century investigations. The surveyor who sketched the marks in Samuel Clark's tunnel in 1852 was not prepared to encounter a symbol set for which he had no classification, and he sketched it and filed it in a drawer, and the sketch survived. Every person who stood at the threshold of one of these spaces and tried honestly to record what they saw, whether they understood it or not, whether they followed up adequately or not, whether their records were preserved or lost, contributed to the pattern that makes the evidence legible in aggregate in a way it is not legible in isolation. The archive is built from 100 small acts of honesty under conditions where dishonesty, or more precisely, the comfortable evasion of selective attention, would have been professionally and personally easier. The archive exists, it is incomplete, and it is scattered, and it is not in the places where the people, with the resources to act on it, tend to look. But it exists, and what it documents is not just the underground passages. It documents the persistent human encounter with the unknown, the reflex to record it even when the context punishes the recording, the refusal on the part of enough people, enough of the time, to pretend that what they found was not there. The passages hold, the archive holds, the question stays open. The relationship between time and stone is not abstract in this story. When Melville pressed his hand against the wall of Site 3 in the summer of 1953, the stone he was touching was Ordovician. Limestone laid down 450 million years before he was born, cut and shaped by tools at a date he could not determine. inscribed with symbols whose meaning had been lost from living memory before the French missionaries ever set foot in the Great Lakes Basin. The scale of time in that single contact is vertiginous. 450 million years of geological time, then an unknown span of human history, compressed into the marks on the wall, then the centuries of European colonial history that had erased the context for those marks, then one careful geologist with a lantern and a notebook standing in the middle of it all, trying to make it legible. The limestone does not care about any of these scales. It holds what it holds. It has held the passage for whatever length of time the passage has been there. It will hold it for whatever length of time remains until development or erosion or subsidence closes it. The stone is indifferent to the urgency that the human dimensions of this story generate, indifferent to the deadlines imposed by the development spreading across the limestone plain, indifferent to the professional timelines and institutional inertia and the small acts of courage or evasion that have shaped the archive. The stone is patient in a way that human institutions are not, and that patience is both a comfort and a rebuke. The evidence will still be there in the passages that have not been backfilled and the walls that have not been buried under foundations. The symbols will still be legible, or some of them will, in the chambers that time and water have not destroyed. The archive will still be accessible in the files at Hamilton and at Queen's, and in Webb's own comprehensive documentation when the institutional conditions for taking it seriously finally shift. Things do shift. The history of how human knowledge of the past is produced is partly the history of questions that were suppressed for too long, and then when suppression became impossible to maintain, became suddenly and explosively important. The pre-Columbian peoples of North America built mounds that covered vast areas of the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio Basin, and for the first 2 centuries of European American settlement, those mounds were attributed to everyone except the actual ancestors of the indigenous peoples, whose descendants were being dispossessed of the land the mounds stood on. The attribution required ignoring a very large amount of evidence, and it required the institutional will to ignore it, and eventually the evidence accumulated to the point where the ignoring became impossible to sustain, and the mounds were acknowledged as what they are. That acknowledgement, when it came, did not make the people who had been dispossessed whole. It did not undo the damage of the false narrative, but it changed the story that was told about the land and the people who had a relationship to it, and changing the story was not nothing. It was the beginning of a more honest accounting. Something similar is possible in Ontario. The underground evidence has been accumulating longer than most people realize, and the institutional resistance to it, while formidable, is not permanent. The researchers who have built the archive in the absence of official engagement have done work that will not disappear. The knowledge that the oral traditions carry, carefully held by communities who have had every reason to protect it, is still accessible to those who approach it with the respect it deserves. The physical evidence, what remains of it, is still in the ground. The moment of reckoning has not arrived. It may arrive in a decade, or 2, or 3. It will arrive because the questions the evidence poses are too important and too well documented to remain permanently suppressed, and because the political and social conditions that have sustained the suppression are themselves in the process of change. In the meantime, the passages hold. The silence holds. The symbols wait on the walls in the limestone dark below the farms and the subdivisions and the roads of southern Ontario. And out there, in the spring evenings when the light is revealing and the frost has opened new collapses in the east fields, old farmers fill in the depressions and drive home, and the ground settles back over whatever lies beneath it, and the cold air from below rises briefly and is gone, and the night comes down, and everything waits. There is a document in the Library and Archives Canada in the RG10, collection of records relating to Indigenous affairs, that most researchers who work on the Ontario underground question have never encountered, because it is not indexed under any of the subject headings that would naturally lead someone to it. It is a transcript of a meeting held in Ottawa in November of 1893 between a federal Indian agent and two representatives of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy from the Grand River Territory in Ontario. The meeting was called to discuss, on the official agenda, matters relating to the administration of the Grand River Reserve. What the transcript shows is that the conversation went considerably off agenda. Partway through the recorded discussion, one of the Haudenosaunee representatives, identified in the transcript only as a chief whose name is spelled 3 different ways across the document's pages, raised the subject of what the transcript calls underground places of the old people. He described in terms that the Indian agent noted in a parenthetical comment were delivered with evident seriousness and without any indication of metaphorical intent, a system of passages beneath the Haldimand Tract, the territory along the Grand River that had been granted to the Six Nations in 1784. He said these passages were older than the oldest memory of the Confederacy, that they had been used in specific ways by specific people within the Confederacy's traditional knowledge system, and that the disruptions associated with the Grand River settlement, which involved significant land clearing and agricultural development, were causing damage to passages that had been intact for as long as anyone could say. He was asking, in effect, for the federal government to take the passages into account in the management of the reserve's development. He was asking for protection. The Indian agent's response, which occupies roughly half a page of the transcript, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. He acknowledged that the chief had raised a concern. He noted that the Department of Indian Affairs did not have a mandate to evaluate subsurface geological features. He suggested that if the chief believed there were items of archaeological interest on the reserve, this could be raised with the relevant provincial authorities through the appropriate channels. He thanked the delegation for their time. The passages were not protected. The development of the Grand River Territory continued. Whatever the chief was describing, whatever had been intact beneath the Haldimand Tract for as long as anyone could say, was exposed to whatever the subsequent century and a quarter of land use brought to it. The transcript was filed in the RG-10 collection, where it has sat since 1893, waiting to be found by someone who knew to look for it. Webb found it in 2008, following a reference in an obscure 1920s historical account of the Grand River Territory that mentioned, in a single sentence, an early council discussion about caves or underground rooms on the reserve. He spent several days in the archives working through the finding aids before locating the 1893 transcript. He photographed every page and added it to the archive. The Grand River Territory is in southwestern Ontario, in the Niagara Peninsula region that was the domain of the Neutral Nation before the 1650s and the territory of the Six Nations after 1784. It is within the zone that Holloway identified as one of her 3 highest concentration areas for documented subsurface anomalies. The correspondence between the 1893 chief's concern and the 20th century documentary record of underground features in the same region is one of those moments in this story where the multiple separate threads of evidence converge in a way that is hard to attribute to coincidence. The Six Nations of the Grand River are today the most populous First Nations reserve in Canada, with a territory and population and a complex ongoing land right situation that has been contentious for decades. The question of what lies beneath the Haldimand Tract, if it ever enters that ongoing situation, would do so in a context loaded with legal, political, and cultural weight that makes the straightforward archaeological question considerably more fraught. The 1893 chief understood that weight. He was asking a government that was systematically eroding his people's land base to protect specific features of that land base for reasons that the government had no framework to evaluate. He was asking from a position of diminishing power at a moment when the weight of colonial administration was bearing down on the Six Nations in ways that made every ask a difficult calculation about where to spend limited political capital. He asked anyway. He was politely told no. He went home, and whatever he knew about the underground places of the old people returned with him to the territory and entered the oral tradition, if it was there already, and was passed forward in whatever form it could be passed, filtered through the subsequent century of disruption and resilience and recovery that the Six Nations endured. Someone at Grand River knows what the 1893 chief knew, or knew something like it, through the chain of transmission that oral tradition provides. Whether that knowledge is still intact, still specific and locationally accurate, or whether it has been generalized and distanced by a century of pressure, is not something outsiders can assess. What is certain is that the door the 1893 chief tried to open was closed before he could walk through it, and the key to that door, if there still is a key, is in the community he represented, not in any institutional archive. Lake Erie has a bottom that nobody has looked at carefully for the specific purpose of finding evidence of pre-contact landscape use. This is worth saying plainly, because the potential of the Great Lakes underwater environment for this kind of evidence is enormous, and the attention it has received, despite a few notable exceptions, is essentially nil. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, with an average depth of about 19 meters and a maximum depth of around 64 meters in its eastern basin. It sits above a limestone bedrock formation, continuous with the Ontario limestone belt. Its bed is predominantly glacial sediment over bedrock, with complex underwater topography in some areas, particularly the shallow western basin where the lake is at its most productive, biologically, and where the water level changes of the post-glacial period would have exposed significant areas of dry land. The western basin of Lake Erie, at the lowest post-glacial water levels, roughly 10,000 years ago, would have had a substantially different shoreline than it has today, with considerable areas of what is now lake bottom exposed as usable land surface. Any habitation sites from that period would now be submerged, preserved in the cold, low oxygen, freshwater environment of the lake bottom. Archaeological sites preserved under these conditions can maintain organic materials, wood and fiber, and plant matter that would not survive on land for more than a few centuries. The potential for sites that preserve evidence of construction techniques, tool use, and material culture in ways that terrestrial sites cannot is significant. One underwater survey of Lake Erie's western basin, conducted in 2017 by a team from the State University of New York at Buffalo, focusing on Paleo-Indian hunting sites, found several features consistent with organized stone placement that the team described as possibly human-made, but that they did not have the mandate or resources to investigate further. The survey report includes brief descriptions of two linear stone arrangements and one roughly circular stone feature that the team found anomalous, relative to the natural geology of the lake bed in that area. They recommended follow-up survey. The follow-up has not been conducted. These features are in American waters, on the south side of Lake Erie, not directly relevant to the Ontario question, but they are part of the same geological formation and the same post-glacial landscape, and the pattern of anomalous, organized stone features appearing at depths consistent with exposure during the lowest post-glacial water levels echoes what the 2002 Alpena Amberley survey found in Lake Huron. The underwater record of the Great Lakes is building a parallel picture to the terrestrial record, and the parallel picture is equally unexamined. The logistical barriers to underwater investigation in the Great Lakes are real. Cold, deep water, poor visibility at depth, complex underwater topography, the technical demands of working in an underwater archaeological context. None of these barriers are insurmountable with adequate resources and will. What they do is ensure that the priority competition for those resources is heavily weighted against a question with no institutional champion and a history of professional non-engagement. The symbol that occurs most frequently in the Ontario Tunnel documentation, the one that Holloway found at more sites than any other element of the symbol set, is the one she described as a concentric circle with a central dot. In her notes, she sometimes calls it the eye, not because she interpreted it as representing an eye, but because the visual effect of the concentric circles with the central point produces, in her description, the impression of looking at something that is also looking at you. This symbol appears in cultures across the world and across time in a frequency that exceeds what cognitive, natural explanation alone can fully account for, at least in the compositional context where it occurs in the Ontario material. In the Neolithic of Western Europe, it appears on the stones at Newgrange and Noath and the other great Boyne Valley monuments, always associated with threshold spaces, with the boundaries between the inner and outer, the above and below. In the Bronze Age Near East, it appears on seals and cylinder weights, associated with temple economies, with the management of exchange between the human and the divine. In the rock art of the Sahara and the Sahel, it appears associated with figures that are interpreted as shamanic or priestly, at the intersection of the human world and the world of spirits. In Ontario's limestone tunnels, it appears, by Holloway's documentation, almost always in close proximity to passage entrances, to the thresholds between the worked passages and larger chambers, and to the points where one passage intersects another. It appears at boundaries. It appears where movement from one space to another is marked. This is not the behavior of a randomly distributed decorative symbol. This is the behavior of a symbol with specific contextual meaning, deployed in specific locations to mark a specific category of spatial relationship. The symbol means something about the places where it appears. It is a threshold marker. It signals transition, the crossing from one kind of space to another. Whether this usage reflects a symbolic tradition shared with those Old World cultures where the same symbol appears in similar contexts, or whether it reflects an independently developed convention that happened to converge on the same visual form for the same contextual purpose, is a question that the current evidence cannot resolve. But the consistency of the usage within Ontario, across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, is itself significant. It tells us that the people who made these passages and chambers shared a symbolic language, that the language had grammatical structure, rules about where specific symbols appeared and what they signified, and that this structure was maintained across a geographic range that implies organized communication and shared tradition rather than local, independent development. This is a writing system, or the precursor of one, not writing in the narrow sense of phonographic representation of spoken language, but a spatial semiotic system, a set of agreed conventions for using marks to convey information about the nature of places and the relationships between them. The people who made these marks were communicating. They were communicating with each other across time and space, leaving information in the passages for others who came after them and knew the code. That code has not been cracked. Nobody has done the systematic comparative work needed to read it. Nobody with the resources and the institutional standing to do that work has attempted it. The messages are on the walls. We do not have the key. Let us spend a moment with the people who lived above these passages in the centuries, immediately before European contact, because their story is both a coda to the deeper history and a tragedy in itself. The late woodland period in Ontario, roughly the last 2,000 years before contact, was a time of considerable cultural dynamism. The ancestors of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples were developing the Longhouse village tradition, the Confederacy political systems, the agricultural practices centered on corn, beans, and squash that would support populations considerably larger than the hunter-gatherer. Communities that preceded them. They were building, in the social and political sense, something sophisticated and resilient, a way of organizing life in this specific landscape that drew on accumulated knowledge of extraordinary depth. The underground passages were part of that landscape. Whatever the late woodland peoples knew about them, the knowledge was embedded in the ceremonial and social practices of their communities. The neutral nations' underground roads, the Wendat elders' galleries of the ancients, the Haudenosaunee traditions about the world below. These were living knowledge, maintained by specialists, regulated by protocols, connected to the spiritual and political authority structures of their societies. When European contact disrupted those societies, the knowledge was among what was lost, not immediately, not completely, but progressively, as the epidemics that killed sometimes 80 or 90% of specific community populations removed the knowledge, keepers and their apprentices together, as the mission system actively suppressed traditional ceremonial practice and the knowledge associated with it, as the political destructions of the 1650s scattered communities across vast distances and broke the specific territorial connections that gave the underground knowledge its meaning. The loss was not total. The fact that Thomas Swifthawk carries knowledge from his grandmother that corresponds to what the documentary record shows is evidence that some of the transmission survived. The fact that an 1893 chief at a bureaucratic meeting in Ottawa spoke with evident seriousness about underground places of the old people is evidence that the tradition persisted well into the colonial period. The fact that stories continue to be held by communities across the province is evidence that the loss, while severe, was not complete, but the full depth of the knowledge that existed before contact, the systematic, locationally specific, protocol-governed understanding of an underground geography that had been maintained and developed over generations, that depth is largely gone. What remains are fragments, preserved by the chance of individual transmission, held by communities who have had to guard what they held against the pressure of a colonial system that spent 2 centuries actively working to destroy it. The injustice of this is specific, not abstract. The people who had the most comprehensive knowledge of what lies beneath Ontario lost most of that knowledge through no fault of their own, through the deliberate and violent disruption of the systems by which it was maintained. The institutions that now have the responsibility for managing Ontario's archaeological and cultural heritage are the institutional descendants of the systems that caused that disruption. The people who might have answered the questions that Melville and Holloway and Webb have been asking are not available to answer them, for reasons that the questioners had no part in creating, but that they and the institutions they have tried unsuccessfully to engage have inherited as a responsibility. This is the full context of the non-investigation, not just institutional inertia or professional risk aversion, though those are real. Also the weight of a history in which the destruction of the people who knew was the precondition of the ignorance that now characterizes the official record. To take the underground evidence seriously is to acknowledge that the people who were displaced from this land had a sophisticated and lasting relationship to it that the official history has not acknowledged. To acknowledge that is to take a step, one step of many, toward the full, accounting that truth and reconciliation asks for, and that the evidence, in this specific domain, has been demanding for a very long time. The Blue Mountain Escarpment is the most prominent physical feature of the Bruce Peninsula, the long finger of Ontario limestone that separates Georgian Bay from Lake Huron. From its highest points, you can see the water on both sides, the Georgian Bay to the east and the wider Lake Huron to the west, and on clear days the distant line of Manitoulin Island, the world's largest freshwater island and a place of profound significance in the Anishinaabe tradition. The Bruce Peninsula is underlain by the same Ordovician limestone formation that runs through the rest of the Ontario belt, but here it is more dramatically exposed, the escarpment face presenting the limestone stratigraphy in cross-section, allowing you to see the rock layers laid down across millions of years of Paleozoic seafloor. The caves and passages here are documented by the Ontario Cave Survey, a volunteer organization that has mapped many of the peninsula's natural cave systems over the past several decades. The Cave Survey's work is careful and valuable. Its focus is natural karst systems, and it has produced detailed maps of several significant cave complexes, most famously the Eramosa Karst in Halton region and the various cave systems of the Niagara Escarpment. What its work does not address, because it is not the survey's mandate, is the question of which of the passages it encounters are natural and which have been modified. The distinction is not always clear, and the survey's protocols are focused on geological description rather than archaeological interpretation. Several individual cave survey members, in conversations with Webb over the years, have described encounters during survey work with features that they found difficult to attribute to natural formation, features inconsistent with the karst processes they understood, features that prompted them to note the anomaly in their survey logs, and then, lacking any framework for taking it further, move on. One experienced caver with 30 years of survey experience on the Bruce Peninsula described to Webb a passage in the Central Peninsula that he had surveyed in the early 1990s and that he had never been able to satisfactorily categorize. The walls showed, he said, signs of deliberate modification, surfaces that had been smoothed and in places shaped in ways that natural water flow did not produce. The passage ran for approximately 40 meters before narrowing to an impassable point. The floor was too level, the ceiling too consistent. It felt, he said, using the word that comes up repeatedly in these accounts, made. He had not published anything about it. It was in his survey notes, available in principle to any researcher working through the Cave Survey archive, but not flagged in any way that would draw attention to it as anything other than a surveyed passage. He was not hiding it. He had just noted what he saw and moved on, and the note was sitting there, readable, waiting. The accumulation of individual accounts like the caver's, small and separately inconclusive, but collectively significant, is the characteristic texture of this subject's evidence base. No single account is sufficient. Any single account can be attributed to observer error, misidentification, the ordinary imprecision of human memory and description. But the collection, the 37 sources that use the word made, the multiple independent accounts of the threshold marking symbols, the convergence of documentary evidence and oral tradition at specific geographic locations, the Melville and Park measurement data, the GPR survey in Kingston, taken together, these constitute a weight of evidence that is not easily dismissed. The challenge is that evidence of this distributed, informal, non-institutional character does not enter the processes by which official knowledge is produced and acted on. Those processes are designed, quite deliberately, to filter out exactly this kind of aggregated, informal evidence in favor of the systematically produced, peer-reviewed, institutionally validated findings that the system is designed to recognize. The filter is not irrational in principle. Informal aggregated evidence is often wrong, often reflects bias and motivated reasoning, often produces the appearance of patterns in what is actually noise. The filter is working as intended, but the filter sometimes eliminates real signals along with the noise. The history of anomalous evidence in many fields is the history of distributed informal observations that were filtered out for too long because the institutions processing the evidence were not set up to take them seriously, until the accumulation became impossible to ignore, or until a specific decisive investigation produced the kind of proof the institutions required. In this case, the decisive investigation has not been conducted, and the evidence therefore remains in the informal distributed state where it began. What would it take to change that? What would it take to convert the informal archive into the kind of institutional attention that could produce the systematic investigation that the evidence demands? Part of the answer is political. The political context in which Indigenous heritage and land rights are managed in Ontario is changing. The recognition of Indigenous rights in the Constitution, the outcomes of various treaty negotiations and court decisions over the past 3 decades, the truth and reconciliation process, all of these have shifted, incrementally but genuinely, the terms under which the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and official heritage management is conducted. A finding that the underground passages of Ontario are real, significant, and connected to the heritage of the nations whose traditional territory they lie beneath would be, in the current political context, a different kind of finding than it would have been in 1955 when Melville presented his preliminary survey, or in 1981 when Holloway made her compilation presentation, or even in 1994 when the Heritage Foundation declined to fund a research proposal on these grounds. Part of the answer is generational. The researchers who have built the informal archive are in many cases elderly or deceased, but the younger researchers who are beginning to engage with the material bring different professional incentives and different institutional contexts. The pre-Columbian contact question, which has been a professional minefield for decades, is gradually becoming more mainstream, not because the evidence for exotic scenarios has improved, but because the evidence for complex Indigenous cultures and long-range connections within the Americas and eventually across the Atlantic and Pacific has become too strong to maintain the old consensus of isolation. As the overall framework shifts, specific questions like the Ontario underground anomalies become less professionally radioactive. Part of the answer, perhaps the most important part, is will. The evidence exists, the archive exists, the oral traditions that could illuminate the physical record are held by communities that might, under the right conditions and with the right relationships, be willing to engage in the collaboration that productive research would require. The will to do the work, to fund it, to protect the people who do it from the professional consequences that have kept the mainstream from engaging to approach the Indigenous knowledge keepers with the respect and the power sharing that genuine collaboration requires, that will has not materialized at the institutional level. It may, with time. The ground will wait. One last story. This one is very recent. In the summer of 2023, a woman named Anaya Bearpaw, who is Anishinaabe from the Wasauksing First Nation on Georgian Bay, was working as a field technician for a geological survey firm contracted to assess a section of the Bruce Peninsula for a telecommunications infrastructure project. The assessment included test bores at a number of locations across the survey corridor. At a bore location in the Central Peninsula, Bearpaw was the on-site technician when the drill broke through into a cavity at a depth of approximately 8 meters. Standard procedure in this situation requires stopping the bore, noting the cavity location and depth, and continuing the survey. She followed standard procedure. She noted the cavity. She noted that the bore probe camera, inserted as part of the standard documentation protocol, showed what she described in her field notes as unusual wall characteristics in the cavity below. She was not an archaeologist, and she did not claim to be. But she was Anishinaabe, and she had grown up with stories about underground places, and she had spent enough time outdoors in the Bruce Peninsula to know the difference between what limestone caves look like in the region and what she was seeing on the probe camera display. She noted in her field notes that the cavity appeared to show evidence of human modification, and she recommended that an archaeologist be consulted before the project proceeded in the affected area. The project manager reviewed her notes, called the firm's senior geologist, and the senior geologist reviewed the probe camera images and agreed that the cavity had unusual characteristics warranting further assessment. An archaeological consulting firm was brought in. The consulting firm's assessment, conducted over 2 days, noted the cavity as a feature of interest, collected sediment samples for dating, and recommended that the project routing be modified to avoid the area. The project routing was modified. The sediment dating results came back in the fall of 2023. The cavity's last open-air period, based on the sediment sample analysis, was placed at between 500 and 2,000 years before present. Late, woodland to early contact period, within the range of known organized activity in the Bruce Peninsula. Bearpaw has not published anything about this incident. The consulting firm's assessment report is in the provincial archaeological file. The sediment dating is in the record. The modified project routing means the area around the bore location will not be disturbed by the telecommunications infrastructure. What lies below is still there, not examined, not excavated, not explained. In the record, categorized and left. When I spoke with Bearpaw, she said something I want to end with. She said, "We know these places are there. We have always known. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether the people who are supposed to take care of this land are going to do their job." She said this without anger. She said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has grown up knowing a thing that the official record does not acknowledge, who has worked within the official system long enough to know exactly where its limitations lie, and who has not lost the expectation that those limitations can eventually be addressed. She said, "They have been there a long time. They will still be there when the institutions catch up." The limestone beneath Ontario is 450 million years old. The passages cut through it are young by comparison, measured in thousands of years rather than hundreds of millions. But in the scale of human time, they are old. Old enough that everything we know about the human past of this region is inadequate to account for them. Old enough that the people who made them and used them and inscribed their walls with symbols we have not read are separated from us by a distance of time that makes them, in the emotional sense, strangers. Remote, but they are not strangers. They are predecessors. They are the people who organize their relationship to this specific piece of ground in ways that left physical marks we are still encountering. They are the people whose descendants carried the memory of what they built, forward through every disruption and catastrophe and forced silence that the subsequent centuries inflicted, until that memory reached Thomas Swifthawk's grandmother, and through her, Thomas Swifthawk, and through him, the possibility of a future in which the knowledge and the physical evidence meet in a collaboration that neither the knowledge nor the evidence has been able to produce alone. That possibility is real. The archive is real. The passages are real. The oral traditions are real. The question is whether the will to bring them together, to support the investigation that the evidence demands, to approach the knowledge keepers with the respect that genuine collaboration requires, will materialize in time, before the development consumes too much more of what is there, before the knowledge keepers are gone and the tradition is broken beyond recovery, before the window that has been open narrowly and incompletely but open for a century and a half closes in the ordinary way that windows close when nobody walks through them. The tunnels beneath Ontario are not, at the end of this long story, primarily a mystery about the past. They are primarily a question about the present, about who we are willing to be, what we are willing to acknowledge, and whether we are capable of the honesty and the collaboration that understanding this land in its full depth would require. The stone holds what it holds. The symbols wait on the walls. The silence at the bottom of the descending passage at Site 3 is as deep as it was when Melville stood at its edge in 1953, and as full of what he did not go far enough to find. Someone will go further. The question is only when, and whether enough will remain when they do, to make the going worth everything it will cost. The ground is patient. It will wait. There is a particular kind of map that geographers call a palimpsest. The word comes from the Greek for scraped clean, referring to the ancient practice of reusing writing surfaces by scraping off the previous text and writing over it. A palimpsest map is one that shows multiple layers of human activity on the same territory, older uses visible beneath newer ones, the present and the past occupying the same physical space at different depths. Southern Ontario is a palimpsest, read from the surface, and it reveals almost nothing of what lies below. Read from below, it tells a different story entirely. The contemporary landscape of the Kingston to Toronto corridor is one of the most intensively managed agricultural and suburban environments in Canada. The fields are drained and fertilized and monitored. The townships are gridded in the concession line pattern of the Crown survey that organized European settlement of the province in the early 19th century. The roads follow the survey grid, and the highways follow the roads. The towns and cities grew on the intersections. The whole thing looks, from above or from the surface, like a system that was built from scratch on unoccupied land by people who knew exactly what they were doing. This is the colonial palimpsest, the top layer, dense and solid and apparently complete. It covers everything before it so thoroughly that its own assumptions feel like facts. The landscape was empty. The land was surveyed and settled and organized. History begins here. But the bedrock does not accept this narrative. The bedrock remembers everything on it, everything cut into it, every mark and passage and chamber that was made before the concession lines were drawn and the first European plows turned the soil. The bedrock is indifferent to the story the surface tells. It holds what it holds, and it has been holding it long enough that the holding is now itself a kind of testimony. The testimony is not accessible from the surface. It requires going below, not metaphorically below, physically below, into the limestone, through the passages, into the chambers, to the walls where the symbols are. The testimony has been waiting there, and everywhere that someone has gone below and found it, they have come back changed whether they fully understood what they had found or not. The silence, the wait, the sense that something considerable had been conducted in these spaces, something that went beyond storage and transit and into the domain of meaning and ceremony and the organized relationship between a people and their underground world. The testimony is patient. The passages are old, and they are deep, and they are difficult to reach, and they are inconvenient and professionally hazardous and politically complicated and institutionally unwelcome. All of this is true. None of it makes the testimony less real. None of it makes the question less important. None of it makes the silence around it less remarkable. Ontario is a province that prides itself on its history. Heritage plaques mark the sites of early European settlements, of colonial era buildings, of battles and treaties and political milestones. The institutional apparatus of heritage management is extensive and professional, and in many domains quite effective. The contrast between the attentiveness with which above-ground heritage is managed and the negligence with which the below-ground heritage has been treated is not easily explained by resource constraints or technical difficulty. It reflects something about what heritage we have decided to prioritize, whose history counts as the history we manage? The answer has been consistently the history that begins with European contact and the written record, the history that preceded it, that lies deeper in the ground and deeper in the oral traditions of the nations who inhabited this land, has been managed by being ignored. This is a failure and not a minor one. The magnitude of what may be lost is being lost. To the ongoing indifference is not calculable because the full extent of what the passages contain has never been determined. But what has been documented in the fragments of the archive that exist suggests that the loss, when it is eventually reckoned with, will be counted among the significant failures of cultural stewardship in the history of this province. The hour is late now. We have been in the dark together for a long time, tracing passages and following evidence and sitting with the weight of what the limestone holds and the silence around it. The story doesn't resolve. There is no satisfying ending here, no discovery that explains everything, no investigation that closes the question. The question is still open. The passages are still there. The symbols are still on the walls, and nobody who has the authority and the resources to read them has come to read them. What remains, as the story settles into its ending, is not resolution, but presence. The presence of what is there, documented and undeniable and still unexamined. The presence of the people who found it over the years, who stood at the edge of something they could not fully explain and wrote it down, carefully and honestly, and added their notes to the archive that makes this story possible to tell. The presence of the indigenous knowledge keepers who have held their own archive through everything that was done to prevent them from holding it. The presence of the question itself, stubborn and real, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to be answered. The ground beneath Ontario is not silent in the sense of having nothing to say. It is silent in the sense of not being listened to. Everything needed to begin listening is there. The documentation exists, the oral traditions exist, the physical evidence exists, or enough of it does. The researchers who understand the material and have spent their careers building the foundation for a proper investigation exist, or at least the archive they built exists, and new researchers are finding their way to it. The listening will happen. Whether it happens before, too much is lost to development, and time is the question that the evidence cannot answer. That answer is up to the people who have the power to decide what this province pays attention to, what history it chooses to take seriously, what ground it agrees to look beneath. The limestone is patient. The passages are old. The symbols on the walls were made by people who understood that things important enough to inscribe on stone in the dark would be found eventually by people capable of reading them, if enough care was taken in the making and enough survived in the keeping. They took the care. The keeping has been imperfect, but enough survives. Enough is there in the deep dark beneath the ordinary surface of southern Ontario to change everything we think we know about who was here and what they built and what it meant to them to build it. The question is open. The door is narrow and difficult to reach and requires going below, but it is there. It has always been there. The limestone waits. The archive waits. The oral traditions wait in the memories of the knowledge keepers who have held them through everything. The symbols wait on the walls, in the cold dark below. The farms and subdivisions and highways of southern Ontario. The silence below is not empty. It is full of something that has been waiting, with considerably more patience than any institution has shown, for the moment when someone decides to listen. That moment is coming. It always comes, eventually, for the questions that matter enough and have enough evidence behind them and enough people persistent enough to keep carrying them forward through the decades when the answer is silence from above. The moment comes because the ground does not change its testimony, and the archive does not stop growing, and the oral traditions do not stop being held, and the people who understand what is at stake do not stop appearing in each generation to take up the work that the previous generation carried as far as it could go. The tunnels are still there. The question is still open. And the night above the limestone plain of Ontario is full of stars that have been there, unchanged since long before anyone cut a single passage in the rock below, watching everything, remembering everything, patient as the stone. This is the story of what lies beneath. The full story has not yet been told. The investigation has not yet been conducted. The reading has not yet happened. But the walls are there. The symbols are there. And somewhere in the dark at the bottom of Melville's descending passage, whatever he chose not to go far enough to find is still waiting, in the silence, for the person who will. The stone holds. The passages run. The symbols wait. The question is open. The investigation that the evidence demands has not been conducted. The collaboration that the knowledge keepers could provide has not been sought with the seriousness it deserves. The window is still open narrowly, and the ground is patient, and the night is long, and everything waiting below the surface of this province will wait a little longer, certain only that what lies beneath Ontario is too significant, too carefully made, and too persistently documented to remain forever unnamed.